Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're talking about one of the strangest and most famous images in all of folklore. Why do witches ride brooms? Of all the things a witch could fly on, why did people settle on a broom? Was it just a silly idea, or does it come from something much older and much weirder than most people realize? In this story, we will look at medieval beliefs, old superstitions, herbal folklore, and even a bit of misunderstood history that slowly turned an ordinary broom into a symbol of magic. Along the way, we will see how fear, rumor, and imagination combined to create the witch we still picture today, flying across the moonlit sky. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you are winding down for the night, or just curious about one of history's oddest questions, thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. A woman kneels on a stone floor and drags a bundle of twigs across the grit. The fire has gone down to coals. Smoke clings to the rafters. A child watches her work from a wooden bench, feet swinging, eyes following the broom head as it scrapes along the seams between stones. Each pass gathers ash, straw, and the black crumbs of yesterday's meal. She tips the debris into a wooden pan and carries it outside. The day keeps moving. Bread needs shaping, water needs hauling, a pot needs scouring. In places like this, across centuries, the broom earns its place as a tool that touches every hour. A broom begins with plants that grow in stubborn soil: heath broom, birch twigs, straw, rushes, whatever a village has nearby and can spare. A stick for a handle, a bundle for the head. Twine, a strip of bark, a length of cord, or a leather thong to bind it tight. Hands do the work. Fingers pinch and twist until the bundle holds its shape. The finished broom leans by the door, ready for the next spill, the next tract in mud, the next drift of ash. People call it different names depending on region and language. In parts of England, besom. Elsewhere, broom, a word that grows from the plant itself. The object stays the same. It belongs to the house. It belongs to the hearth. It belongs to the people who clean up what life leaves behind. Men use brooms too. They sweep barns. They clear threshing floors. They tidy workshops. They brush mud off steps. In the home, though, the broom sits closest to women's work because women spend more hours inside the walls. A household needs constant attention. A floor turns foul fast when animals share a room, when smoke drops soot, when rain brings clay into the doorway, when straw bedding breaks apart. Cleaning becomes routine, and routine becomes identity in the eyes of neighbors. A woman with a broom in her hand looks like order. A woman who keeps her hearth and floor clean looks like competence. People notice. They comment. They judge. In tight communities, small habits become public knowledge. The broom also turns into a marker. A tool left in a certain place tells a story. A broom propped in a doorway can signal that someone is away. A broom set against a wall can show that the floor was swept, that a task was completed, that a home is ready for visitors. In some communities, the broom takes on ceremonial weight. Couples jump a broom in wedding customs meant to mark a threshold. A household uses a broom to sweep out a room before a gathering, clearing the dirt and showing respect. These actions stay physical. A broom moves dust. Feet lift over a handle. Neighbors watch. Memory stores it. The same object moves between labor and ritual because people reuse what they already have. That overlap between daily life and ceremony gives the broom its first shadow. Any item used around thresholds, doors, hearths, and beds picks up stories. Those are the places where people are born, fed, sickened, and buried. A broom stands by the entrance where strangers knock. It leans near the fire where food cooks. It touches the floor where children crawl. It sweeps the area around a bed where someone sweats with fever. If a household believes in charms, the broom becomes part of that practical magic. A family might hang a broom to discourage pests. A mother might place a broom across a doorway to keep a child from wandering out. A household might sweep in a particular pattern out of habit, or because an elder insisted it mattered. None of this requires a devil, a spell book, or a midnight meeting. It requires a community that carries small beliefs like tools in a pocket. The earliest ideas that connect brooms to airborne movement come from human bodies, not from the sky. Villagers dance, they leap, they straddle poles in games, in fertility rites, in seasonal festivals that survive in scraps of record and in later accounts. Picture a field after harvest. The ground is rough with stubble. A bonfire burns. Men and women drink ale from wooden cups. Someone bangs a drum. Someone sings. People form a circle. They jump and shout until their lungs burn. In that kind of night, someone might grab a broom or a staff and ride it as a joke, a dare, or a gesture meant to push luck toward the next crop. A person who jumps while straddling a stick gives a simple illusion. For an instant, both feet leave the ground. The body lifts, the stick points forward. The crowd laughs. Someone swears they saw the rider rise higher than a normal jump. The story grows after the ale runs out. Those moments matter because later authorities take them seriously in the worst way. Churchmen, magistrates, and writers who already fear pagan custom look for symbols to condemn. They fix their attention on common objects, because common objects are easy to find. A carved idol can be hidden. A secret book can be burned. A broom stands in every home. Once suspicion attaches to it, no one can claim ignorance. The broom becomes the perfect prop for accusation because it sits within reach of every hand, including the hands of women who have little power to defend themselves. Before any court begins to write about witches on brooms, Europe already carries a heavy load of anxiety about women and household authority. A woman knows herbs because she treats fevers, stomach pains, infected wounds, menstrual trouble, and difficult births. She knows which plant quiets a cough and which plant makes a person vomit. She learns this from older women, from trial and error, from watching animals chew certain leaves, from listening to travelers speak of remedies in other regions. Her neighbors ask her for help because they have few choices. A village might have a priest. It might have a barber surgeon. It rarely has a trained physician. When a child cries through the night with a burning forehead, a mother walks to the woman with the herbs. When a cow stops eating, a farmer asks the same woman to come and look. When a wife bleeds after childbirth, someone runs for her in panic. These are physical scenes, people sweating, hands shaking, a room smelling of smoke, blood, and boiled water. The herbalist arrives with a pouch of dried leaves and a calm voice. She takes over the room because urgency demands it. Her authority creates resentment. Some men resent it. Some women resent it too, especially when they compete for status or resources. If a patient survives, the healer gains credit. If a patient dies, the healer becomes a target. Death comes often in the medieval world. Infection takes people in days. Childbirth kills mothers. Hunger weakens bodies through winter. In that environment, blame becomes a kind of relief. It gives grief a shape. It gives anger a direction. A community that already believes in curses can decide that a death came from malice rather than misfortune. Once that decision sets in, every familiar object in the accused woman's house turns into evidence. A pot becomes a cauldron, a pouch becomes a poison kit, a broom becomes a vehicle for secret travel. The broom's link to women's work tightens this logic. People already associate brooms with female presence in the home. They associate the hearth with women's labor, women's talk, women's discipline, women's disagreements. The broom is visible. It can be described in a sentence. It can be pointed at in a crowded room. A neighbor who wants to accuse someone can say, "I saw her with her broom at an odd hour. I saw her sweeping at night. I saw her leaving her broom by the door." None of these observations prove anything. They sound concrete. They sound ordinary. That is exactly why they work. Courts and communities often prefer the ordinary detail because it gives a confession the feel of real life. In the late medieval world, authorities also build a theory of witchcraft that depends on travel. If witches meet to plot, they need a way to get there. If they harm distant crops, they need a way to reach distant fields. If they gather in secret, they need a way to evade watchful neighbors. Stories already exist about supernatural flight in older folklore. Saints ride clouds in legends. Spirits cross distances in a breath. Dreams carry people through the night. The idea of night travel already lives in human imagination. A broom offers a simple physical anchor for that imagination. It is long. It can be straddled. It looks like a stick horse. It belongs to women. It sits near the door like it is waiting to leave. When fear looks for a vehicle, the broom volunteers itself. The early images of witches riding brooms carry this same mixture of banality and dread. They do not show queens of darkness with jeweled crowns. They show ordinary women in work clothes, headscarves, plain dresses, faces that could belong to anyone's aunt. The broom under them makes the scene feel like a distorted version of daily life. That distortion sharpens the edge. The threat comes from within the village, from within the home, from within the sphere that men often dismiss until it turns dangerous. There is also a private dimension that later confessions drag into the open. Household objects touch bodies. The broom handle is smooth from hands and from use. When authorities begin to claim that witches use ointments and apply them in intimate ways, they weaponize shame. They pull private practices into court language. They force accused women to speak of their bodies under pressure, sometimes under torture, in front of men who have power over them. The broom becomes a tool for humiliation because it is both domestic and phallic in the minds of accusers who fixate on sex. This is one of the darkest engines of the broom myth. It gives interrogators a way to turn a common object into a dirty symbol, and then to present that symbol as proof of evil. In everyday life, none of this needs to be true for the legend to grow. A broom exists in almost every home. That ubiquity does the work. It means any story that uses a broom can travel fast because every listener can picture it. A rumor about a rare artifact dies when people cannot imagine it. A rumor about a broom stays alive because everyone has held one. Everyone knows its weight. Everyone knows how it feels to straddle a stick as a child and pretend it is a horse. A broom carries that childhood play inside it, along with soot and dust. When fear arrives, it borrows the object's familiarity and makes it sinister. The scribe sharpens his quill with a small knife and blows the shavings off the desk. He sits close to a window because winter light fades fast. Outside, the street smells of damp wood and horse manure. Inside, the room smells of ink, parchment, and smoke from a brazier. He copies words that carry a warning. Heresy spreads like an illness, the priest says. Secret meetings happen at night, the priest says. Women speak in those meetings, the priest says. And men listen to them. The scribe keeps his head down and writes. He has learned how quickly the wrong idea turns into a charge, and how quickly a charge turns into a sentence. On the edge of the page, the illuminator sketches figures that look like people he has passed in the market. A woman with a headscarf, a woman with a plain dress, a woman with a broom under her legs. The first broom riders in the record do not arrive as characters in a children's tale. They arrive as suspects. In 15th century Europe, the church fights older religious practices, local folk customs, and organized dissent. Reform movements grow in pockets across the continent. Some are quiet and some are loud. Some try to simplify worship. Some reject church authority. Some allow women a voice that parish life rarely grants. Authorities label these groups with names that stick. Then they attach those names to charges that terrify the public. The Waldensians are one such group. Their opponents call them witches and devil worshippers in pamphlets and sermons, and the accusation spreads. A label like that does not need solid evidence to cause harm. It needs repetition. It needs a few witnesses who fear punishment and want to survive. It needs a court that treats confession as truth and treats refusal as proof of guilt. A manuscript from the middle of the 15th century contains an image that becomes a seed. A woman sits astride a broom, and another sits astride a stick. The figures wear ordinary clothing, the kind that signals modesty and poverty. The scene links women, heresy, and illicit movement in a single picture. It carries a warning that lands in the eye before it lands in the mind. The woman looks like a neighbor. The broom looks like a household tool. The idea that she might ride it through the air lands with a jolt because the object stays familiar. The picture does not need to explain itself. Viewers fill in the rest with whatever they already fear about secret meetings and unruly women. A page like that travels among clerics and educated elites. Then fragments of its ideas drift down into common talk. Talk changes faster than doctrine. In villages, people trade stories at wells and ovens and taverns. They trade stories while they mend nets and spin wool. A rumor about a woman seen outside after dark attaches to a rumor about herbs. A rumor about herbs attaches to a rumor about sickness. Then someone mentions a broom left leaning in a strange place. The broom becomes a detail that makes the story feel true. A peasant does not need a theological treatise. A peasant needs a picture in the head. A broom rider provides that picture. The story spreads because it feels concrete. People can describe it in a few sentences. They can argue about whether it happened. They can laugh while repeating it, then fall silent when the wrong person walks into the room. Authorities learn how to use these stories. They build an image of witchcraft that depends on meetings, travel, and conspiracy. A witch who stays home does not fit their model. A witch who rides out to a Sabbath does. The Sabbath itself serves a purpose. It turns scattered fears into a single event. It makes witchcraft sound organized. It makes it sound like a rival church. It gives prosecutors a structure for interrogation. It gives judges a structure for verdicts. A suspect who can be forced to say, "I went to the meeting, and I saw these people there," becomes a tool for mass arrest. A suspect who can be forced to say, "I traveled through the air," becomes a spectacle. Spectacle matters because it draws attention and builds support for persecution. It turns the audience into accomplices. The broom becomes useful because it gives flight a prop that everyone already understands. In the middle of the 15th century, Trials begin to collect these details. The broom rider appears in confessions, and those confessions appear under pressure. Courts use confinement, threats, and torture. They use isolation. They use sleep deprivation. They use the fear of fire. A prisoner learns fast that silence earns harsher treatment. A prisoner learns that agreement brings relief. When an interrogator asks, "How did you travel?" the prisoner looks for the answer that matches the interrogator's expectation. The interrogator has heard stories. The interrogator has read pamphlets. The interrogator has a priest whispering nearby about devils and pacts. The interrogator offers the suspect the words to say. The suspect repeats them. The scribe writes them down. The page becomes evidence. The evidence becomes precedent. The precedent becomes a script that other interrogators follow. A priest named Guillaume Edelin becomes a case that later writers cannot stop repeating. He stands in a courtroom in France in the 1450 seconds, surrounded by officials who treat dissent as danger. Edelin has criticized witch trials, and that alone makes him a threat to those who run them. He also has enemies who benefit from his fall. The proceedings grind forward. Questions turn into accusations. Accusations turn into demands for confession. Under torture, Edelin says he used an ointment. He says he anointed a stick. He says he rode it. The details change in retellings, but the structure stays. Ointment, staff or broom, flight. The structure fits what authorities want. It fits what the public finds horrifying. It also fits what later artists can draw in a single frame. A man or woman on a broom, lifting away from a roofline, gives a clean silhouette. The image does the work that 1,000 pages of court language cannot. Printing accelerates this process. As the 15th century ends and the 16th begins, woodcuts and broadsheets turn witch stories into mass media. A printer can carve a simple scene into a block and press it again and again. The details do not need to match any specific case. They need to match the public's expectation. A witch rides a broom. A devil waits nearby. A cauldron boils. A village burns. A mother cries. People buy the sheet, pin it to a wall, talk about it with their neighbors, and carry it to the next town. The broom rider becomes a standard image, as recognizable as a crown on a king. When fear has a standard image, fear becomes easier to sell. The broom rider also serves as a way to police women in public space. A woman who moves freely already draws attention in many communities. A woman who walks alone at night draws suspicion. A woman who lives outside a household controlled by a husband or adult son draws suspicion. A widow draws suspicion. A midwife draws suspicion. A healer draws suspicion. A poor woman who argues with neighbors draws suspicion. When prosecutors and priests describe witches, they describe women whose lives already sit on the margins. The broom does something important here. It turns those women into agents. It turns them into people who can act with speed and reach. A village that feels powerless in the face of disease, failed harvests, and war can accept the idea that someone nearby has secret power. Secret power makes an event feel explainable. It also makes punishment feel meaningful. Religious conflict feeds this hunger for explanation. Europe in this period holds tension like dry wood holds heat. The church faces criticism. Reform movements split communities. Wars reshape borders. Plague returns in waves. Families watch children die in a single week. People search for causes. They also search for scapegoats. Priests and magistrates provide scapegoats because scapegoats protect authority. A witch who rides a broom to a Sabbath provides an enemy that can be hunted. That enemy also supports sermons about obedience, sexuality, and proper behavior. The witch becomes the example used to scare the faithful into conformity. The broom becomes the marker of her crime because it belongs to domestic life, the very sphere that moral teaching tries to control. The charges also become more explicit about sex, and the broom sits at the center of that ugliness. Interrogators ask about pacts with devils. They ask about physical acts. They ask about bodies. They ask questions designed to humiliate. The broom handle appears in these accounts as an object of shame and power. A prosecutor can describe a broom and force an accused woman to talk about it in front of men. He can put her on a bench, bind her wrists, and keep pressing until she repeats his words. The record then preserves the humiliation. The record travels. It turns into a story that people tell with a grin and then with a gasp. It turns into a warning used against other women. The broom rider becomes a figure of uncontrolled female sexuality in the minds of those who want control. That association spreads through the same channels as everything else: sermons, pamphlets, tavern talk, and courtroom theater. At the same time, the image remains stubbornly ordinary. That is the part that makes it stick. A noble woman on a gilded horse looks distant. A poor woman on a broom looks close. The closeness creates unease. A household can lock its door against bandits. It cannot lock its mind against the thought that the woman who borrowed salt last week might ride past the chimney tonight. The chimney itself becomes part of the staging. Houses have chimneys. Houses have roofs. People already imagine smoke leaving the chimney and rising. That vertical movement becomes an easy mental bridge to flight. Artists draw witches leaving through chimneys because it makes a strong picture. Viewers accept it because they have watched smoke move that way since childhood. There is a practical detail that plays a role in the background. Rural communities store brooms near the hearth because the hearth provides heat and keeps tools dry. A broom by a fireplace stays within reach. A broom handle may end up darkened by soot. A visitor sees it leaning near the fire and thinks nothing of it. Later, when suspicion spreads, that same broom becomes a clue in retrospect. People begin to reinterpret objects. That habit drives witch panic more than any single event. Once a community decides someone is dangerous, every ordinary choice becomes part of the case. Why did she keep her broom there? Why did she sweep at that hour? Why did she leave it outside? Why did she carry it to the field? None of these acts are crimes. Under fear, they become evidence. Courts in this period also rely on spectacle. A trial draws crowds. People want to see the accused. People want to hear the accusations. Some come out of genuine fear. Some come out of boredom. Some come because they want to confirm their suspicions. A confession that includes broom flight provides entertainment and moral reinforcement at the same time. It gives the crowd an image to carry home. It also gives them a sense of participation. They watched the sinner exposed. They watched authority restore order. They leave with a story that confirms what they already believed. The broom rider then becomes a piece of folklore that feels official because it came from a court record, even when it came from torture. In some regions, accusations also track social conflict. A dispute over a boundary, a debt, a broken promise, a dead animal, or a failed batch of beer can end in an accusation. The accused woman may have used a broom in the course of the dispute, sweeping a doorstep, cleaning a stall, working in a tavern. A neighbor can point to that broom and turn it into a symbol of the woman's supposed power. A story about flight sounds extreme, and extreme stories can overwhelm mundane facts. The accuser does not need proof of flight. The accuser needs a community ready to believe that the accused carries hidden abilities. Once that readiness exists, the broom works like a flag. Some intellectuals and clerics argue about the nature of witch flight. They debate whether it happens in the body or in the mind. Some claim devils carry witches through the air. Some claim witches imagine it in dreams. These debates still end up serving persecution because the accused remains guilty under either theory. The debate gives prosecutors a way to sound educated while still burning people. It also gives writers new ways to describe the same scene. A broom rider can be portrayed as physically flying or spiritually traveling. The public rarely cares about the distinction. The public cares about the picture of a woman breaking the rules of nature and society, leaving her house without permission, and meeting others in secret. That picture feeds fear and keeps it alive. A girl grows up in this world hearing the stories before she understands them. She hears them in half sentences. She hears them as jokes. She hears them as threats whispered during arguments. She hears them when adults warn her to avoid certain houses. She watches women sweep and she watches men watch them. She learns which women receive smiles and which women receive narrowed eyes. She learns that a broom can be a tool and a symbol at the same time. She learns that symbols can kill. A boy grows up learning a similar lesson. He learns that female knowledge can be framed as danger. He learns that the home can be treated as a battlefield in moral teaching. He learns that a woman who steps outside expected behavior becomes a target. The broom rider becomes the shorthand for all of it. By the time the broomstick witch becomes a common figure in European imagination, the image rests on a foundation built by courts, printing, religious conflict, and local grudges. It also rests on a simple physical fact. A broom looks like something a person can straddle. Children already do it in play. Adults already saw people do it in festival games. Once authorities decide that witches travel to secret meetings, the broom offers itself as the simplest vehicle. It stays in the corner of the house, the most ordinary object in the room, waiting for someone to claim it carries a person into the night. A woman sits at a rough wooden table with a candle stub pushed into a blob of wax. The flame shakes each time the door opens. On the table, she lays out dried leaves, seeds, and small roots on a flat board. She sorts them by smell and texture. She keeps some in cloth packets tied with string. She keeps others in a clay jar sealed with fat. Her hands move in practiced motions. She pinches a leaf, rubs it between her fingers, and brings it to her nose. She spits a bit of bitter root into her palm and wipes it away with the edge of her apron. This work happens in kitchens and sheds across Europe for centuries. It happens because people get sick and because doctors are scarce and expensive. It also happens because knowledge passes through women more often than courts admit. A mother teaches a daughter which plant calms a cough. A midwife teaches an apprentice how to boil water and keep cloth clean. A healer learns how much of a herb is safe by watching what happens when someone takes too much. The difference between relief and poison sits in the size of a pinch. A court looks at that table and sees a crime. A magistrate hears about jars and packets and decides the jars hold curses. A priest hears the names of plants and decides the names belong to the devil. When a village falls into fear, ordinary remedies get retold as dark recipes. The accusation pulls medicine into the language of sorcery because it makes a clear villain. It also gives officials a reason to intervene in private life. They can search a house. They can question a woman about what she keeps in her cupboard. They can treat her knowledge as a threat to public order. Once that shift happens, the broom begins to sit beside the pot and the pouch as part of a single story. The story says the woman uses herbs to change her body and then uses the broom to travel. That story does not grow from careful observation. It grows from interrogation. The pattern appears early. In 1324, a noble household in Ireland falls into scandal and bloodshed. Lady Alice Keiteler stands at the center of it. She has married multiple times. She has money. She has property. She has enemies who want what she has. When her fourth husband falls ill and dies, suspicion tightens around her like a rope. The charges against her pile up. They include poison. They include heresy. They include dealings with a demon. Investigators claim they find a powder and an ointment. The language in the records turns domestic objects into evidence. A small pipe or container becomes proof of secret practice. A wooden staff becomes proof of travel. The story says she greased a staff and rode it at night. The claim enters the archive and stays there. Keiteler escapes. She flees before the court can bind her. Her servant, Petronilla de Meath, has no escape. Petronilla is questioned. She is beaten. She is forced to speak. She becomes the body the court can punish in place of the body that slipped away. She is executed. The crowd watches a woman burn and learns a lesson about power. The lesson has a second layer. The lesson says a woman who knows too much and lives outside a man's control can pull everyone into danger. These early cases matter because they show the basic mechanics. Officials look for an object that can carry the accusation. Ointment serves that purpose. It sits on the edge between medicine and poison. People already accept that salves can change the body. A salve can stop pain. A salve can ease a rash. A salve can warm skin. It becomes easy to accept that another salve can do something stranger. When fear meets an ointment, fear supplies the result. A prosecutor asks, "What did you put in it?" A suspect names plants she has used for years. The prosecutor writes the names down as ingredients of evil. A judge hears that list and imagines a recipe book. The crowd hears that list and repeats it with new details. Soon the ointment becomes the hinge between the broom on the wall and the flight in the story. The plants most often mentioned in these accounts are plants with real effects. Henbane, belladonna, mandrake, hemlock, thornapple, and other members of a rough family of dangerous herbs grow in fields, along roads, and at the edge of gardens. They smell sharp. They taste bitter. They can kill. They can also sedate. They can dry the mouth, blur vision, race the heart, and flood a person with confusion. A healer learns to fear them and to respect them. She knows that a small amount can dull pain. She knows that a larger amount can drop a person into a deep sleep. She knows that a careless dose can stop breathing. This is practical knowledge. It comes from bodies and mistakes. It also comes from desperation. If a person screams with toothache, people will try anything. If a person thrashes with fever, people will try anything. When a community lacks reliable medicine, risky plants get used anyway. In court records and later witch-hunting manuals, these plants show up in a more extreme role. Writers claim witches use them in an ointment that allows flight. The claim often includes a specific method. The ointment gets rubbed onto a stick, a staff, or a broom. Sometimes the confession claims the ointment gets applied to the skin. Sometimes the confession uses explicit language about application to intimate areas. These details serve a purpose in the courtroom. They push the accused into shame. They give the interrogator control. They also make the story vivid for listeners. Vivid stories spread. A confession that sounds boring does not travel far. A confession with sex, ointment, and flight travels fast. There is also a plain pharmacological reason why the story of flight appears so often once these plants enter the narrative. When tropane alkaloids enter the body, a person can experience disorientation so intense that the mind loses the usual sense of place. The person may feel as if they are moving when they lie still. The person may see scenes that feel real. The person may experience bodily sensations that seem physical. These are hallucinations and delusions built from the brain under stress. People in the medieval and early modern world rarely have a framework to describe drug-induced hallucination as a chemical event. They describe it as a spiritual event. They describe it as a dream sent by devils or spirits. They describe it as a journey. If a person under that influence later tries to explain what happened, flight becomes a workable word. It matches the sensation of movement. It matches the social stories already circulating. It fits the interrogator's script. A doctor in the 16th century, Andrés de Laguna, provides one of the clearest examples of the gap between lived experience and interpretation. He hears about witch ointments and decides to test one. He describes a case in which a woman is rubbed with a salve and then falls into a long sleep. When she wakes, she insists she has enjoyed great pleasures and becomes angry when told it was a drug-induced state. Her anger is a physical scene. She lashes out. She complains. She believes her experience was real. Laguna looks at the same scene and sees a chemical reaction. He sees a body that absorbed a plant compound and entered a delirium. He concludes that the sensation of flight and the sensation of erotic encounter can be products of the substance itself. His conclusion does not end witch trials. Courts rarely adjust their procedures based on a physician's doubt. The public also prefers a moral story over a medical one. A moral story assigns blame. A medical story assigns chance and biology. The same pattern plays out again and again in witch trial testimony. An accused person is questioned about nighttime travel. The accused person describes it in the language available to them. Some speak of dreams. Some speak of being carried. Some speak of riding. The interrogator presses for details that match the theory of the Sabbath. The interrogator asks, "How did you get there?" The accused person, exhausted and frightened, chooses the most recognizable vehicle in her home: a broom, a staff, a pitchfork, a familiar object. This choice then becomes a stable detail in the written record. The record becomes a template used in later trials. The template pushes future confessions toward the same detail. Over time, broom flight becomes less an observation and more a required answer. The mechanics of interrogation matter here because they shape the reality that later generations inherit. A confession extracted under torture is rarely a free narrative. It is a negotiation for survival. A prisoner watches what makes the interrogator satisfied. The prisoner learns that the interrogator wants certain features. The interrogator wants a pact. The interrogator wants a devil. The interrogator wants a meeting. The interrogator wants names of accomplices. The interrogator wants proof of flight. The prisoner provides these features because pain and fear narrow the mind to one goal: getting the questions to stop. The prisoner does not need to believe the story for the story to end up on the page. The scribe records it anyway. The record then enters the system as truth because the legal system treats confession as the highest proof. Women in these courts often face a second layer of vulnerability. They sit in front of men who control their bodies and their futures. Many are poor. Many have no education. Many have no advocate who will risk angering authorities. Their social position already makes them easy targets. When they confess, they use the material of their own lives. They mention a broom because a broom stands in their house. They mention an ointment because they have used salves for ordinary problems. They mention a pot because they cook. They mention a bundle of herbs because they dry herbs for tea and for poultices. In that way, their daily labor becomes the raw material of the accusation. The court takes the visible world of a woman's life and rearranges it into a story of evil. Some cases include details that suggest a real practice beneath the hysteria. Folk healers did create salves and tinctures. Some were meant to relieve pain. Some were used as sedatives. Some were used in reproductive contexts, to induce menstruation or miscarriage, to ease childbirth, to reduce bleeding. Those uses sit close to taboo and fear. Male authorities often respond to female control over reproduction with obsession and panic. When a midwife has the ability to influence pregnancy outcomes, she holds power that men in church and state want to regulate. If a woman is suspected of using herbs to cause infertility or miscarriage, the accusation can slide quickly into witchcraft. Once witchcraft enters, the same herb knowledge becomes a weapon in the story. The ointment turns into flying ointment because it provides a dramatic result. There is also the question of application. Some historical accounts suggest that these salves were sometimes applied to skin areas where absorption is faster. That can include mucous membranes. It can include the armpit and groin. Such application can deliver a strong effect without swallowing the substance, which reduces nausea and makes dosing more controllable. A practitioner who learns this through experience might treat it as practical technique. A court treats it as indecency. A pamphlet writer treats it as proof of depravity. The same act becomes different things depending on who holds the pen. In the hands of witch hunters, it becomes pornographic detail used to inflame disgust. Once the idea of flying ointment spreads, it changes how people interpret normal sickness and normal behavior. A woman who becomes delirious from fever might babble about movement, voices, lights, and strange meetings. Her family might already fear witchcraft. Neighbors might already whisper about her. A priest might already preach about devils in the night. When she says she flew, the statement sticks. It might begin as fever talk. It ends as testimony. The same happens with substances. If someone steals or discovers a jar of ointment in a suspect's house, they might smear it on an animal, on a tool, or on a person out of fear or curiosity. If the substance contains psychoactive plants, the person might experience delirium. Then the community receives a vivid story that seems confirmed by experiment. The cycle feeds itself. The broom's role becomes clearer here. A broom is long and smooth enough to be treated like a staff. It is also associated with the hearth and with women. In the logic of witch hunters, that makes it ideal. They want an object that links the accused woman to both domestic space and transgressive movement. The broom provides that link. The broom also provides plausible deniability within the story. A woman can leave her house holding a broom and no one asks why. She can walk to a barn to sweep. She can go to a neighbor's house to help clean after sickness. She can carry it along a lane without drawing attention. That normality becomes a cloak in the imagination. The story says she hides her secret travel in plain sight. That detail makes the story satisfyingly sinister to people who already suspect deception. Court records sometimes describe witches riding sticks, forks, poles, and animals. The broom eventually dominates because it has a clear identity. It shows up in art. It shows up in satire. It shows up in sermons. It belongs to women's labor in a way that a random pole does not. When a storyteller wants to signal witchcraft fast, a broom does it in a single beat. The icon grows through repetition. Ointment helps lock it in place because ointment provides the mechanism. A broom without a mechanism is just a stick. A broom with ointment becomes a device. That is how the myth gains internal logic. The logic sounds crude, yet it satisfies the mind's desire for cause and effect. Rub the broom, mount it, fly. This period also produces a class of writers who act like prosecutors on paper. They compile tales, confessions, and theories into manuals. They claim to describe how witchcraft works. They list ingredients. They list rituals, they list signs, they pretend to offer certainty. Their certainty becomes a tool for institutions. A judge with doubts can lean on a manual. A priest with doubts can preach from a manual. A neighbor with doubts can borrow the manual's language to accuse. The manual creates a shared script. Once the script includes ointment and flight, those elements become expected features in future cases. Even a suspect who has never heard of flying ointment may learn about it during questioning, when an interrogator describes it as if it is already known. The bodies involved in these cases pay the cost. A woman is arrested. She is kept in a cell that smells of urine and damp straw. Her wrists are bound. Her hair is cut. Her skin is searched for marks. She is questioned for hours. She is shown instruments. She is promised relief if she speaks. She is threatened with pain if she refuses. She begins to say whatever will end the session. She names herbs she recognizes. She describes an ointment. She describes a dream. The interrogator turns the dream into a journey. The interrogator turns the ointment into a magical fuel. The interrogator suggests the broom. The woman repeats the broom. The scribe writes. A verdict follows. In many regions, that verdict ends in execution. There is an irony in the way chemistry sits inside this cruelty. The same plants that courts frame as tools of evil also exist in the wider medical world. Physicians and apothecaries use dangerous substances in controlled ways. They prescribe opiates. They use belladonna in tiny amounts for certain conditions. They bleed patients. They purge them. They give them compounds that can harm as much as they heal. When a learned man uses a drug, the act can be framed as medicine. When a poor woman uses a drug, the act can be framed as witchcraft. That difference is not based on chemistry. It is based on status, gender, and institutional authority. The broom rider myth thrives in that gap because it sits on the border between knowledge and permission. It punishes those who practice outside approved structures. In some places, the story of flight begins to shift as skepticism grows among certain elites. Some argue that devils deceive women through dreams. Some argue that the body remains in bed while the mind wanders. This argument still condemns the accused because it frames the experience as sinful and voluntary. It also keeps the broom in play. A dream still needs an image. The broom can exist as a dream vehicle. That allows authorities to keep the icon while adjusting the explanation. The icon matters more than the physics. The icon keeps the public afraid. It also keeps the public entertained. A printer sets a fresh sheet of paper onto the press bed and checks the edges with his fingertips. The shop smells of ink, damp paper, and hot metal from a small stove. An apprentice rolls ink onto a carved woodblock, and the printer lowers the platen with a practiced pull. When he lifts it again, a picture appears in reverse, and then in truth. A woman rides a broom through the night sky. Her skirt flares around her knees. A small animal clings close to her. Below her, rooftops tilt at sharp angles, and a chimney juts up like a finger. The image dries on a rack beside other sheets. There are words, too, set in cramped type, describing a confession, a meeting, a pact, and a punishment. The printer does not argue with the content. He counts coins. He stacks pages. Fear sells well. By the 16th century, witch hunting has moved beyond local grudges and parish gossip. It becomes a system that repeats across regions. Courts develop routines. Clergy develop language. Town councils develop procedures for arrest, imprisonment, and execution. The broom rides along in this machinery because it fits the new need for a clear public image. The accused often come from the edges of the social order: widows, servants, midwives, beggars, women who live alone, women who speak sharply, women who sell herbs, women who have few protectors. When authorities drag them into court, the charge rarely stays small. It expands into a complete story. That story includes travel, because travel suggests planning and coordination. A witch who can move quickly becomes a threat to multiple households, multiple farms, and multiple parishes. When a judge wants to convince a crowd that execution is necessary, he benefits from a narrative that sounds organized and dangerous. The broom rider provides that. People already know the shape of a broom. People already know what it looks like leaning by a door. When they hear that a woman used that object to leave her house and meet others in secret, the familiar shape turns into a weapon in the mind. A courtroom in a market town runs on physical routine. Guards walk prisoners in with their wrists bound. A clerk sits with ink and paper. A magistrate sits elevated behind a table. A priest stands nearby and watches faces in the crowd. Witnesses step forward and point. They describe quarrels. They describe dead livestock. They describe a child who wasted away after a fever. They describe butter that refused to form. They describe ale that turned sour. Each detail lands as a small stone, and the pile grows. Then the questions shift. The magistrate asks about meetings at night. He asks about leaving the house. He asks about roads and crossroads. He asks about barns, fields, and lonely places. The accused woman may answer in fragments. She may cry. She may refuse. She may beg. The magistrate presses until the answers resemble the story he expects. He asks how she traveled. She mentions a stick, a staff, or a broom, because that is what she owns and what the question seems to require. The clerk writes the words down as if they arrived clean and voluntary. The crowd hears the phrase and repeats it when they leave. By the time the day ends, the town has a new piece of gossip, and the gossip now carries the stamp of the court. The broom also gains a stage through public punishment. Executions happen in daylight, in open fields, or near the edge of town where many can gather. People bring children. They buy bread and beer from vendors. They climb wagons or stand on barrels to see better. Officials read charges aloud. Sometimes a condemned person speaks. Sometimes she remains silent. The sentence ends with fire, hanging, or beheading depending on local law and custom. The crowd watches the body struggle, then stop. Afterward, people talk about what they saw. Some feel relief. Some feel excitement. Some feel sick. Many feel a hard satisfaction that order has been restored. In that talk, the details of confession become as important as the death itself. A broom flight confession gives the crowd something easy to repeat. It also gives them an image they can hold on to. A woman leaving a chimney or rising above a field. The execution confirms the story in the mind of anyone who already feared witches. A person who doubts may keep quiet, because doubt can invite suspicion. Chimneys become a key part of the broom image because chimneys sit at the center of household life. A chimney marks a home from a distance. It also marks a home from inside, because it draws smoke and smell upward. People watch smoke lift every day. They watch sparks climb. They watch soot gather. They sweep ash from the hearth with small brooms and brushes. Artists and pamphlet makers use this because it is easy to draw and easy to understand. A chimney provides a clean vertical line. A witch on a broom provides a clean diagonal. Put them together, and the image reads instantly. This is one reason the chimney departure appears so often in prints and paintings. The public recognizes the parts. The public supplies the motion in the mind. The story gains force even when trial records show far fewer literal chimney departures than later folklore suggests. The printed image ends up shaping memory more than testimony. Painters contribute too. In the Low Countries and elsewhere, artists fill scenes with devils, cauldrons, and flying figures. A viewer can stand in front of a print and point at the broom riders. The viewer can laugh, then look again and feel uneasy. A picture gives people permission to imagine witches as a real category of person, not just a rumor about a neighbor. The image also standardizes details. The broom becomes the default vehicle, even when local stories used other objects. The witch becomes old, then sometimes young. Her hair becomes wild. Her face becomes sharp. An animal appears beside her, a cat, a toad, a hare. These visual habits spread because artists copy each other and because buyers want what feels familiar. Over time, the broom rider turns into a stock figure. When people see a broom leaning by a door, they can now see two things at once. They see a cleaning tool. They also see the outline from the print, a woman rising above a roof. This is also the period when professional witch hunting takes shape in some regions. Some authorities appoint men to seek out suspects, gather testimony, and pressure confessions. These men travel from village to village and apply a method. They ask the same questions. They watch reactions. They look for conflicts that can be turned into charges. They focus on households already under strain. A poor family with debt becomes vulnerable. A widow who relies on charity becomes vulnerable. A woman who asks for food and gets refused becomes vulnerable, because the refusal can lead to guilt if misfortune follows. If a cow dies after an argument, the owner wants a cause. A witch hunter supplies it. He tells the owner that witchcraft works through spite and envy. He tells the owner to remember every odd moment, every harsh word, every look. The owner now reviews his life like a ledger and picks out anything that can support the charge. He might remember a broom in a corner. He might remember seeing the woman carrying it at dusk. He might remember her sweeping outside when the air felt strange. The witch hunter writes it down. The detail gains a place in the official story. Witch trials also depend on chains of accusation. A frightened prisoner names others because naming others can reduce pressure, delay execution, or satisfy interrogators. A named person is arrested, questioned, and pushed to confess. That second person names more. Soon the whole village is caught in a net. In that environment, confession becomes a currency. People offer details that sound convincing. Details about brooms sound convincing because brooms exist everywhere. A prisoner can say she saw another woman leave on a broom because the listener already knows what that looks like in the mind. A prisoner can say she met others at night because night meetings already exist for ordinary reasons. For lovers, for thieves, for neighbors who want privacy. The court merges ordinary behavior with the charged story. People who survive often do so by aligning their words with what the court expects. People who refuse can face harsher pressure. As the machinery runs, the broom rider becomes more common in records, and the records then become proof for the next court. Writers who claim expertise add another layer. They compile cases, rumors, and theological claims into books that promise clarity. Judges and clergy use these texts as references, and the texts then influence how interrogations proceed. The books describe how witches travel, what they do at meetings, and what signs reveal them. The books often include the broom, the ointment, and the Sabbath, because these details make the story vivid. A vivid story helps a judge persuade himself that he is acting for the good of the community. It helps a priest persuade a congregation that harsh measures are justified. It also helps local officials justify spending money on prisons, guards, and executions. Once a bureaucratic machine forms around witch hunting, the machine needs a steady supply of cases. The Broom Rider story supports that supply because it makes witchcraft sound active and urgent. Within households, the broom becomes a site of fear in small gestures. A woman notices her neighbor's broom left outside and thinks about rumors. A man walks past a doorway and sees a broom leaning at an angle and thinks about a pamphlet he read. A child hears adults mention broom flight and begins to look at chimneys with suspicion. A family in a tense village might even hide their brooms or keep them out of view, though the work still needs doing. People keep sweeping. They keep cleaning stalls and floors. The fear does not remove the broom from life. It changes the meaning people attach to it. A tool becomes a symbol, and symbols can pull people into violence. The legal process rewards the kind of speech that fits the script. When a witness says, "I saw her ride a broom," the witness gains attention. The statement sounds specific. It sounds like a scene. It can be repeated. A witness who says, "I dislike her," or "I argued with her," offers less. Courts often prefer a dramatic claim that reaches beyond ordinary conflict. That preference encourages further dramatic claims. It also encourages the accused to confess in dramatic terms, because drama signals compliance with the interrogator's worldview. Once the broom becomes established in that worldview, it becomes a reliable element to include. The Broom Rider confession becomes a ritual. It functions as a passage in the interrogation, a key that unlocks the next stage, the naming of accomplices, the description of meetings, the description of devils, the description of harm. The broom becomes a narrative hinge that turns domestic life into conspiracy. Across Europe, these patterns vary by region, law, and religious leadership, yet the broad effect remains. The Broom Rider image spreads farther than any single court. It crosses borders through printed sheets, traveling preachers, soldiers, merchants, and displaced families. A traveler carries a story from one town to another. A preacher repeats it in a sermon. A local official uses it to justify a new round of arrests. By the time large parts of Europe begin to pull back from the worst witch panics, the Broom Rider has already hardened into folklore. It is also hardened into art and popular entertainment. The picture persists even when some judges and scholars begin to question the reality of physical flight. The picture persists because it is useful. It gives people a clear enemy. It also gives them a clear story to tell. A town crier stands in a square with a paper in his hand and reads aloud. The crowd shifts and murmurs. Names come out one by one. Some listeners cross themselves. Some stare at the ground. Some exchange looks that carry old grudges. The crier reads the charges in the same tone he uses for taxes and lost livestock. The flatness of his voice makes the content feel official, routine, settled. The story of a broom ride becomes part of civic life, as ordinary in the public ear as a regulation about market weights. That is the moment when myth turns into public record in the mind of the community. A broom leaning in a corner can now carry the full force of law and punishment because law has spent decades teaching people what to see when they look at it. A woman stands at the edge of a crowded room with a broom in her hand because she arrived early and the floor looked bad. Mud has dried in ridges near the door. Straw and ash cling to the corners. She works in short strokes, pulling the dirt into a pile, then pushing it into a pan. Men sit at a table behind her and talk without lowering their voices. They talk about prices, about a sick cow, about a neighbor who refuses to pay a debt. Someone laughs. Someone spits into the rushes. The woman keeps sweeping. When she finishes, She leans the broom against the wall and goes to the hearth to stir a pot. Later, when arguments break out and someone needs a target, her broom becomes part of the story people tell about her. They say she always has it in her hand. They say she always stands at thresholds. They say she watches who comes in and who goes out. The broom stays visible. Visibility turns into suspicion when a community decides it needs a villain. Across early modern Europe, the broom sits inside a larger fight over who gets to hold authority inside a household. The household is where food is stored, money is hidden, children are raised, and labor is organized. Women manage much of that work. They decide how long flour will last. They decide when to sell eggs. They decide how to stretch a stew. They decide which child gets an extra piece of bread on a cold day. They also manage information. They know who has been sick. They know who is pregnant. They know who is short on fuel. They know which husband drinks too much. These facts move through a village like smoke from a hearth, and women often carry them. When a society feels stable, that informal authority can sit alongside the formal authority of men. When a society feels threatened, informal authority becomes a problem. Officials prefer order that runs through channels they control: church, court, guild, and household headed by a man. Women who hold influence outside those channels draw attention. The broom, as the simplest sign of women's domestic role, becomes a tool for accusing a woman of stepping beyond her place. Work that keeps people alive also creates opportunities for conflict. Brewing is one example. In many towns and villages, women brew ale for their households and sometimes for sale. Brewing requires grain, a large pot, water, and time. It also requires trust, because buyers cannot judge quality until they drink. A woman who sells ale can earn cash. She can lend small sums. She can refuse to extend credit. She can support herself after a husband dies. She can compete with male brewers when markets and guild rules shift. People watching these changes find ways to interpret them as moral threats. A broom outside a door can serve as a simple sign that ale is available, the way a shop sign announces a trade. If a town begins to resent the woman who sells ale, the sign outside her door becomes a prop in the story. She stands near a threshold. She takes money. She argues with customers. She keeps a cat to catch mice near stored grain. She uses herbs to flavor or preserve. Those are ordinary features of the work. Under suspicion, they become ingredients of a charge. The broom as a sign of ale becomes the broom as a sign of witchcraft. The shift happens through gossip, resentment, and the desire to discipline women who earn money. Midwives and healers face a sharper danger because they enter the most vulnerable rooms. A midwife arrives when a woman is screaming in labor, sweat on her face, hair stuck to her neck, hands clamped onto the bed frame. The midwife washes her hands. She warms cloth. She checks the mother's breathing. She gives instructions to women in the room. She may send a man to fetch more water. She may send a child to heat stones. She makes decisions fast. If the birth goes well, families thank her. If the mother bleeds, if the child comes still, if infection follows, grief looks for a cause. In communities that already accept witchcraft as a working explanation, suspicion can land on the person who touched the body and gave orders. A midwife also knows plants that affect the body, and that knowledge creates more fear. Courts and clergy often treat female control over reproduction as dangerous. A broom, again, becomes a symbol that links the woman to the home and to the private acts that men want to regulate. A prosecutor can describe the broom as a tool of household order and then twist it into a tool of household sabotage. The same prosecutor can claim that the woman used the broom to travel to secret meetings. The story makes her sound organized and predatory. It turns her practical work into conspiracy. Property disputes push the same pattern. A widow who inherits land or a house becomes an object of interest. Neighbors watch her decisions. Officials watch her payments. Relatives watch her boundaries. A widow might refuse to remarry. She might take in a lodger. She might rent part of her land. She might sell goods in the market. Those actions can trigger resentment because they challenge expectations. If she is sharp with words, if she refuses charity, if she demands what is owed, she becomes easier to frame as spiteful. People in debt to her want her quiet. People competing with her want her weakened. When misfortune hits, a sick child, a failed crop, a dead pig, the rumor can form. The rumor can travel fast because it serves interests. A broom leaning by her door becomes a convenient detail. It allows a witness to describe her in a simple sentence. She stood there with her broom. She watched me. She muttered. She left. That detail becomes the kind of thing a court clerk can write down, and the written down detail acquires authority. These accusations take shape through specific actions in specific places. A woman asks for milk. A neighbor refuses. The woman leaves angry. A week later, the neighbor's cow stops producing. The neighbor thinks about the argument. The neighbor asks others if they have trouble too. Someone suggests the angry woman. The neighbor tells the story again, and this time the story includes more detail. The woman stood at my threshold. The woman held a broom. The woman looked past me into the house. The neighbor repeats the story to a local official. The official asks questions. The official suggests answers. The official wants the story to fit a known pattern. The pattern includes a curse, a quarrel, a mark, and a meeting. The broom slides in because it sits in the same domestic space where the quarrel began. Once a case moves into court, the broom becomes part of a larger set of symbols used to paint the accused as disorderly and threatening. The woman's voice becomes evidence against her. Her anger becomes evidence. Her poverty becomes evidence. Her independence becomes evidence. Men also face witchcraft accusations, yet the broom rider image stays tied to women because the broom is tied to women's labor in the public mind. That connection makes the broom rider story useful in sermons about proper behavior. A preacher can stand in a church and describe a woman who should have stayed by her hearth and instead rides out at night. The preacher can connect that to sin, to sexuality, to disobedience, and to the breakdown of household discipline. Listeners carry that message into everyday interactions. They watch women's behavior more closely. They interpret disagreements as threats. The broom becomes a warning sign. It is a short step from saying a woman keeps a dirty house to saying she keeps a dangerous house. It is a short step from saying she sweeps at odd hours to saying she sweeps away blessings from other homes. This chapter also belongs to a period of religious conflict that changes how communities talk about magic. As Protestant reform spreads, and as Catholic authorities respond, both sides emphasize discipline, purity, and clear boundaries between acceptable practice and forbidden practice. Older folk customs that once sat comfortably beside church life become targets. People who once used charms or spoken blessings at home find that those habits draw scrutiny. Women often preserve these customs because they manage births, sickness, and death inside the home. A charm spoken over a child with a fever becomes suspect under new religious pressures. A bundle of herbs hung near a door becomes suspect. A broom used in a household cleansing ritual becomes suspect. Officials treat these domestic acts as evidence of spiritual rebellion. The broom rider legend benefits because it offers a clean and frightening picture of the home turning against the church. A woman uses a household tool to break rules that clergy claim come from God. That story fits the needs of institutions trying to enforce uniform belief. Then the story crosses the Atlantic with people who carry fear as part of their luggage. A ship leaves an English port and pushes into rough water. The deck is crowded with barrels, rope, and bundles wrapped in cloth. Families huddle under canvas. A woman grips a railing while the ship pitches. She has a small broom because everyone needs one in tight quarters. People sweep spilled grain, mud tracked from the deck, ash from a small cooking fire. The broom stays close because space stays scarce. These travelers bring more than tools. They bring sermons they heard, pamphlets they read, and stories they shared in the dark. They bring a legal imagination shaped by European witch hunts. When they land in New England, they build towns where the church and the court overlap. They build a culture where neighbors watch neighbors as part of religious duty. In such places, private conflicts become public quickly. In a Puritan household, domestic order becomes a moral issue. Floors are swept, beds are made. Children are kept quiet during prayer. A wife who fails to maintain order risks criticism that goes beyond mess. The criticism touches salvation, reputation, and a husband's standing in the church. Women carry the burden of those expectations, and women also carry the blame when the household falls short. That burden grows heavier when the community faces threats, harsh winters, crop failure, disease, raids, and political uncertainty. People sleep with muskets close. They bury children in frozen ground. They watch their stores run low. Under those pressures, fear finds targets in the usual places, among people with few protectors, people who argue, people who ask for charity, people who refuse to submit. Women accused in New England often fit patterns familiar from Europe: poverty, isolation, quarrels, and reputations shaped by rumor. The Salem crisis in 1692 brings these dynamics into sharp focus. A group of young girls shows strange behavior, convulsions, shouting, complaints of pinching and biting sensations, claims of seeing figures. Ministers and magistrates treat these claims as evidence of witchcraft. The legal system accepts testimony about unseen harm and unseen presence. Accusations spread fast. People name neighbors. Neighbors name others. The jail fills. Interrogations demand that suspects explain how they performed harm and how they met with other witches. Some confess. Some refuse. Confession can spare a life in some cases, because authorities focus on the unrepentant as the most dangerous. Confession also feeds the story. A confessor supplies details about meetings, animals, and travel because the interrogators expect those details. The European law that includes broom flight exists in the background even when specific testimony focuses on other elements. The cultural image of witches traveling at night and gathering in secret helps judges and ministers explain what is happening. It helps them argue that a coordinated enemy operates within the community. The broom rider remains part of that larger mental picture, even when a transcript does not mention a broom. The broom also returns here as a symbol of women's domestic identity. A woman accused in New England may still be the woman who sweeps the floor, who tends the hearth, who keeps food from spoiling, who washes linens, who attends births, who sits by a sickbed. When she becomes accused, the story turns her domestic role into a mask. Witnesses claim she came to their bedside at night. Witnesses claim she entered their house without opening the door. Witnesses claim she left marks. The domestic sphere becomes a battleground in the mind of the community. The broom already tied to the threshold and the hearth, becomes one more piece of that mental equipment. Even when people do not say broom aloud, they picture a witch moving through household space with ease because they already associate witches with women and women with household tools. Men in authority use written accounts and sermons to frame these crises, and those texts circulate. They connect New England fears to European fears. They reinforce the idea that witches form networks. They reinforce the idea that witches travel at night. They reinforce the idea that women's bodies and women's habits can hide secret sin. Through these channels, the broom rider image stays alive. It survives because it remains useful in moral teaching and in popular storytelling. After the Salem executions end and doubt grows, the imagery still remains. A community can reject a court's actions while still keeping the mental picture of the witch. The picture offers a way to talk about chaos, social conflict, and fear of women who speak and act outside expected roles. Back in Europe, skepticism rises in some circles during the late 17th and 18th centuries. Some courts demand stronger evidence. Some elites grow embarrassed by earlier excesses. Yet the broom rider image continues in popular culture because it has become a shorthand. It conveys a category of person in one stroke. It also allows humor. A tavern can tell a story about a neighbor on a broom and get a laugh, while still reinforcing the idea that certain women are dangerous. The humor sharpens the cruelty because it makes accusation feel like a game until it becomes a death sentence. Women feel this in daily life. They learn to manage their anger in public. They learn to avoid quarrels with powerful neighbors. They learn to accept poor treatment, to avoid suspicion. They learn to keep their herb knowledge quiet. They learn to hide their small rituals. A broom stays by the door, and it becomes a reminder that the smallest domestic detail can be turned into a weapon. A police constable stands at the edge of a fairground and watches a man sell pamphlets from a wooden tray. The seller keeps his voice loud and steady. He tells the crowd about a witch who rode out at night. He describes a broom. He describes a meeting. He describes a confession. People lean in close, then step back and laugh as if they have heard the story before. The constable knows the mood has changed. A century earlier, a magistrate might have ordered arrests based on the same claims. In this fairground, the claims land as entertainment. The seller counts coins and keeps talking, because the crowd keeps buying. A young boy holds the pamphlet with both hands and studies the crude picture on the cover. A woman with long hair sits on a broom above a roof. The lines are rough. The image still lands fast. It does not need careful reading. The boy folds the paper and tucks it into his coat as if it matters. In courtrooms across parts of Europe and the American colonies, the legal appetite for witchcraft cases shrinks over time, and the change begins in practical steps. Judges start demanding clearer proof. Ministers argue with each other about visions and dreams. Officials worry about disorder when accusations spread too far and start hitting families with influence. A town that executes too many people loses labor, loses stability, and invites backlash. Some communities reach a point where they look at the wreckage and decide they have had enough. A few judges refuse to accept spectral claims. A few juries refuse to convict. A few officials shift charges away from witchcraft and toward fraud or public disturbance when someone claims magical powers. The shift does not arrive as a clean break. It arrives as hesitation, as a delayed warrant, as a clerk who writes less, as a magistrate who prefers a fine over a hanging. For the accused, the difference means life. A woman who once would have been marched to a stake or a gallows walks out of a cell and returns home with a ruined reputation and a body weakened by confinement. She still has to sweep her floor. She still has to face neighbors. She still has to live with the knowledge that the same village could turn again if fear rises. As formal prosecutions decline, the witch figure moves into culture in a new way, and the broom travels with her because it already has a strong outline. The broom works in a drawing, in a quick carving, in a stage prop, and later in a photograph and film. It tells the viewer what kind of character they are looking at in a single second. Artists who want to sell prints keep using the broom because buyers recognize it. Theater companies keep using it because it reads clearly from the back row. A comic writer keeps using it because it gives the audience a familiar joke. The broom becomes a tool of shorthand, and shorthand survives even after people stop believing the full story. That survival also suits authorities. A state can reject witch trials and still permit mockery of witches on stage. Mockery helps distance a society from its recent violence. It gives people a way to treat the old fear as foolishness, which saves face for families who once participated in accusations. It also pushes the pain of earlier victims out of the public mind, because laughter makes it easier to move on without accountability. Domestic life changes in the 18th and 19th centuries, and those changes reshape the broom's place in the home and in the imagination. Urban households grow. City streets fill with soot and mud from horses, carts, and factories. Cleaning becomes constant work. Brooms become more standardized as manufacturers produce them in larger quantities. A broom in a shop window becomes a common sight. A woman carrying a broom becomes a common sight. At the same time, popular media expands. Cheap prints, satirical cartoons, and later magazines circulate widely. A cartoonist can draw a politician as a witch to suggest deceit or corruption, and the audience understands the insult because the broom makes the meaning immediate. A cartoonist can draw a scolding older woman as a witch for a cheap laugh, and the audience understands the joke because older women have long carried the stereotype of the dangerous neighbor. These images do not need court records. They draw on the memory of older stories while stripping away the legal consequences. The witch becomes a mask people use in arguments about power and gender, and the broom becomes the object that makes the mask readable. Halloween traditions expand and change in the 19th century and into the 20th, especially in places where immigrant communities bring older seasonal customs and blend them with new commercial habits. Families carve vegetables and later pumpkins. Children wear costumes and knock on doors. Storekeepers decorate windows to attract buyers. A witch silhouette becomes a practical decoration because it can be cut from paper and taped to glass. It can be printed on a poster. It can be painted on a sign. The broom gives the silhouette its most distinctive line. A hat and a broom tell the whole story even when the face stays blank. That simplicity makes the broomstick witch spread across neighborhoods in a way that more complex images cannot. Once it becomes a seasonal decoration, it becomes part of childhood memory. A child sees it in October year after year, and the association sets in before the child learns anything about the historical deaths that built the image. Early film and stage entertainment lock the broomstick witch into a new form. Costume designers use long skirts, pointed hats, and exaggerated noses because those shapes read well on stage and on screen. They add a broom because it gives the actor something to hold and something to mount. It turns a static costume into an action. A performer can swing a broom onto a shoulder, stomp across a stage, and get laughs. A performer can sit on it and be lifted by wires and get gasps. The broom becomes a piece of theater equipment as much as a symbol. When film studios make fantasy stories, They use the same cues because audiences already recognize them. In the late 1930s, audiences watch a witch with green skin appear on screen in a major film, and the broomstick image becomes part of mass entertainment for generations. The character's voice, costume, and posture leave a deep imprint. People leave the theater talking about the witch because she feels vivid and because the broom gives her a clear physical relationship to the world. She does not float like a ghost. She rides like a person using an object, which makes the fantasy feel tangible. As the 20th century continues, television and advertising keep the broomstick witch in constant circulation. A cartoon can draw a witch on a broom in a single frame and move on. A cereal box can show a witch stirring a pot and leaning on a broom. A Halloween candy wrapper can print the silhouette again and again. Children absorb the image through repetition. Adults use it as a seasonal signal. The broom becomes part of the visual language of autumn in many places. This creates a strange split. The broomstick witch becomes cute in some contexts and menacing in others. A children's cartoon gives her a silly laugh and a clumsy landing. A horror poster gives her sharp teeth and a dark sky. Both versions use the same broom because the broom supplies instant recognition. The object does not care what story it serves. It stays stable while tone changes around it. During these same decades, real people start to reclaim the word witch for spiritual practice, for identity, and for political statement. Some build new religious movements rooted in older folklore and ritual ideas. Some practice folk magic within families and pass it quietly from one person to another. Some take inspiration from pre-Christian traditions, seasonal festivals, and nature-based spirituality. In these communities, the broom returns as a household tool with ritual use. People make their own brooms from birch, straw, or other materials. They bind them with cord. They hang them near doors. They use them in simple cleansing rituals that involve sweeping a room before a ceremony or sweeping near a threshold as a symbolic act. These practices remain physical. A person moves a broom across a floor. A person tidies a space. A person marks the start of a gathering by cleaning. The broom also appears in wedding customs, where couples jump a broom to mark a marriage in a public and memorable act. The jump is literal. Feet lift and land. Friends clap. Photographs capture the moment. The broom holds meaning because it connects domestic life, work, and a chosen ritual identity. This reclamation creates a second split in the broom's meaning. In popular entertainment, the broom often signals a female villain or a comic outsider. In modern spiritual communities, the broom can signal belonging and practice. The public may not see the difference because the same object sits at the center, yet the behavior around it changes. A person who identifies as a witch today may own a broom that never leaves the floor, and they may also enjoy the old image of flight as a symbol of freedom. Another person may reject the flight image while still keeping the broom as a tool for cleaning and ceremony. These choices play out in ordinary spaces, apartments, backyards, small gatherings, bookstores, and community centers. People talk about it in plain language. They describe what they do and why they do it. They also talk about the history with anger because the old accusations killed people. The broom carries that tension because it sits in the center of both the violence and the later reclamation. Museums, historians, and educators add another layer by returning to the records and explaining how the image formed. They point to court transcripts, to woodcuts, to sermons, to pamphlets, to the social pressures that made accusations spread. They describe torture and coercion. They describe how judges and clergy shaped confessions, They describe how poison fears and medical ignorance turned herb knowledge into suspicion. They describe how domestic objects became legal evidence. This work changes how some people view the broomstick witch, especially adults who learn the scale of the violence for the first time. A person who once saw the broomstick witch as a harmless decoration reads testimony about women executed after forced confessions and starts to see the image differently. They might still decorate for Halloween. They might still enjoy fantasy stories. They also carry a sharper awareness that the image grew from real pain. That awareness does not erase the icon. It adds weight to it in the mind, and it changes the way some people tell the story to their children. The broom survives as the central prop because it ties together the core elements that have always driven the myth. It ties witchcraft to women and to the home. It ties witchcraft to motion and travel. It ties witchcraft to secrecy, because a broom can sit in plain sight without raising alarm. It also ties witchcraft to play, because children naturally treat long sticks as things to ride. That connection to play matters more than people admit. A child who runs through a yard straddling a broom learns the physical posture of the icon before learning any theology or history. The posture embeds itself in the body. Later, when that child sees a witch in a cartoon, the child recognizes the posture and laughs. That bodily recognition keeps the icon alive across generations without any need for belief. A costume store in late October provides a clean view of how the image functions in the present. Plastic brooms hang on hooks beside hats and capes. Some brooms come apart into 3 pieces for easy packaging. Some have glitter on the handle. Some have orange straw. A customer picks one up and swings it through the air to test its weight. The customer smiles because it feels like a prop, light and simple. In the same store, a cleaning aisle in another part of town sells sturdy household brooms meant for kitchens and sidewalks. A shopper grips a wooden handle and checks the bristles for stiffness. That shopper thinks about dirt, not witches. Both brooms share the same basic form. Their context changes their meaning. The form remains constant because it works. A broom looks like a tool and a vehicle at the same time. That dual identity keeps it useful for stories. At a modern Halloween parade, a woman in a witch costume walks down a main street. She carries a broom over her shoulder. Children wave. A marching band plays. A volunteer hands out candy. The woman smiles and keeps walking. A few spectators take photos. The scene stays bright and ordinary. Behind that scene sits a long history of accusations, forced confessions, and executions that built the icon in the first place. Most spectators do not think about the courts or the burnings while they clap. The parade still depends on the same object that once appeared in trial records as proof of criminal flight. The object has moved from evidence to decoration. It has moved from terror to play. It has moved from persecution to profit. The broom survives every shift because it remains easy to recognize and easy to use. Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into the long and dramatic story of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Rome that refused to disappear. How did an empire that began as Rome's continuation become something entirely its own, with glittering mosaics, towering churches, court intrigue, and armies fighting on every frontier? And how did Constantinople, a city built between 2 worlds, manage to endure for more than 1,000 years? As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you? And if you like these stories, please like and subscribe. This is the easiest way to support this channel. Whether you're settling in for sleep or simply looking for a calm way to travel through history, thank you for being here. Now, Let's begin. A rider came through the Golden Gate with mud on his cloak and a leather tube tied to his saddle. He pushed past carts and pedestrians on the main road, then slowed when the street narrowed and the crowd thickened. The city smelled of fish from the harbor, smoke from cooking fires, and sweat from men hauling rope. He kept his eyes forward. A guard at an outer checkpoint stepped into his path and held up a hand. The rider pulled a lead seal from the tube and showed it. The guard looked once, then waved him through. The rider rode on toward the palace quarter, where marble colonnades framed the street, and men in clean tunics walked with their heads up, as if the air itself demanded a straighter spine. Inside the great palace, an official took the tube and carried it past courtyards where fountains ran into stone basins. The messenger waited under a painted ceiling while servants moved through side doors with trays of bread and olives. He watched a clerk press a stylus into wax and copy a line. He watched another man weigh coins on a small scale, then close a wooden box with a practiced snap. The palace ran on routine. It ran on paper, wax, and seals. It ran on the steady movement of orders from one room to the next. Then the tube reached an inner chamber, and the routine changed. A man with a narrow face broke the seal and read fast. He turned and walked through a door without asking permission. Emperor Zeno sat with a few advisors and a map spread on a table. The map showed the sea, the long coastlines, and the old names that still mattered in Constantinople. A servant poured water into a cup and stepped back. The official bowed and handed over the message. Zeno took it without ceremony. He read, and his mouth tightened. The Western court in Italy had fallen. The boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus, had been deposed. The man who removed him, Odoacer, sent the imperial insignia east. The old symbols were on their way to Constantinople, wrapped in cloth and guarded like treasure. The room stayed quiet while Zeno read again, as if a second reading might change the ink. He set the message down and looked at the men around him. They were not surprised by the violence. They were surprised by the finality. For a century, the West had leaned on emergency and improvisation. Generals raised armies with promises. Emperors came and went in a few months. Cities paid ransoms to avoid sacks. Now the West had no emperor at all, and the last act came with the careful politeness of a package delivery. Zeno tapped the table with one finger, slow and steady, and spoke about titles, legitimacy, and the weight of that insignia when it arrived. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The message said one clear thing. Constantinople held the imperial office alone. Outside the palace walls, the city kept moving. The harbor cranes creaked. Longshoremen cursed as they rolled barrels of wine and oil. Bakers shaped dough and slid loaves into ovens. In the hippodrome, the factions argued about races that had already happened and races that had not yet happened. A man in a dye shop leaned over a vat, stained to the elbows, and listened to a rumor that the West was gone. He shrugged. Rome was far away. His life sat within sight of the sea walls, and the sea walls still stood. He cared about bread prices, taxes, and whether the next shipment of grain arrived on time. Constantinople cared about those things too. That was one reason it survived. The city rewarded men who kept lists, counted sacks, and sealed doors. Zeno had other problems that did not wait for news from Italy. He had enemies within his own court, and enemies on the borders. He had soldiers who expected payment, and generals who expected promotions. He had to manage the religious arguments that stirred crowds faster than any tax decree. He also had a very practical question about Italy. Odoacer ruled there as king. He held the army. He held Rome. He also held the loyalty of men who once served imperial officials. Zeno could send an expedition, and that would cost ships, gold, and lives. Zeno could send a letter, and that would cost ink. He chose a third option that fit the Eastern style of survival. He chose to point one threat at another. To the north and west, Theodoric led the Ostrogoths, hardened soldiers with families and wagons, settled uneasily in imperial territory. They were nominal allies, paid with land and promises, and they behaved like men who expected more. Theodoric wanted a kingdom. He wanted legitimacy. Zeno wanted Odoacer removed from Italy. So Zeno spoke to Theodoric as a man speaks to another man who craves a prize. He offered Theodoric authority, a commission, and a road that led away from Constantinople. Theodoric gathered his people and marched. The road west filled with wagons, horses, children, and armed men. Their movement looked like migration and invasion at the same time because it was both. Years later, after battles and negotiations, Odoacer was trapped in Ravenna. He surrendered under terms. Then Theodoric killed him at a banquet. The story traveled back to Constantinople in whispers and then in official letters, polished into acceptable language. The empire gained a result. Italy was held by a king who claimed a Roman mandate and who also understood that Constantinople watched him across the sea. This was how the Eastern Empire operated in the shadow of collapse. It pulled levers. It used titles as tools. It used gold as a weapon. The gold mattered more than the speeches because gold traveled farther than armies. The solidus, minted in bright yellow metal and stamped with an imperial face, passed from hand to hand in Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and beyond. A soldier accepted it. A merchant accepted it. A foreign chieftain accepted it. The emperor's image on that coin turned into food, weapons, and loyalty. When the West broke into kingdoms, their rulers issued coins too, but many of those coins carried the ghost of Roman forms. Some carried an Eastern emperor's name because that name still meant something in the market. Constantinople also held a physical advantage. Theodosian walls rose in long, thick lines, built in layers with towers that allowed defenders to move and shoot. A man on patrol could walk those walls and see the sea in one direction and the land beyond in another. He could see small boats and big ships. He could see distant dust on roads. He could see warning signs early. The walls did not guarantee safety. They bought time. Time allowed the palace to send orders, to gather troops, to pay allies, and to close gates. The West had strong walls in places too, but it lacked the centralized machine that could keep those walls staffed and supplied year after year. When Zeno died in 491, he left a court that hated him and an administration that still functioned. He also left a succession crisis that could have torn the empire apart. A crowd gathered at the Hippodrome, impatient and loud, demanding a ruler who fit their idea of legitimacy. In the palace, officials and guards chose Anastasius, a civil servant with a careful manner and a reputation for counting money. He was older, with a calm face. He married the widow of Zeno to strengthen his claim. Then he sat down at the desk that mattered and began work. The first years of Anastasius brought internal conflict. Men who had benefited under Zeno tried to keep their power. Soldiers muttered. An Isaurian war broke out as armed groups resisted the new regime. Anastasius responded with steady force. He sent commanders into the rugged regions. He built supply lines. He paid troops. He waited out the rebellion and reduced it piece by piece. While generals fought in the hills, clerks in the capital kept writing. That division of labor kept the empire alive. Men bled in the provinces. Men stamped documents in the city. The taxes still came in. Anastasius cared about money with a directness that bordered on obsession. He reformed the coinage, issuing better small copper coins that made daily trade easier for ordinary people in the market. He also abolished a hated tax on trades and professions that had driven people into debt and bribery. These changes did not come with speeches about mercy. They came with orders, enforcement, and a clear expectation that the state would get its revenue in a form that actually worked. In the background, Anastasius built up the treasury. He did it slowly, and he did it while maintaining the army. By the end of his reign, he left a large surplus, counted in solidi, stacked and sealed. A ruler can buy peace with that surplus. A ruler can buy time. A ruler can also buy a war. War came anyway. In 502, the Persian king Kavad invaded Byzantine territory. The two empires had watched each other across the border for centuries, trading blows and letters, trading prisoners and insults. In this war, Persian troops took the city of Amida after a brutal siege. The defenders died on the walls and in the streets. The survivors went into captivity. The news reached Constantinople, the way bad news always did, carried by tired men who spoke in simple phrases. The emperor's advisors gathered. Orders went out. Anastasius mobilized troops and money and pushed back. The war dragged on through marches and sieges until a peace was arranged, then broken, then arranged again. Anastasius responded the way he responded to everything. He built. He fortified. He laid out a new stronghold at Dara near the frontier, with walls, towers, and storage enough to support troops. He gave the generals a place to hold. He also gave the Persians a problem they would have to reckon with later. Inside the empire, another conflict gnawed at stability. Religion was a constant force in Byzantine politics because it governed identity, legitimacy, and the loyalty of cities. The Council of Chalcedon had defined doctrine in the previous century, and many people in the eastern provinces rejected it. They argued about the nature of Christ in terms that sounded technical and also carried violence in their wake. Emperors tried to maintain unity, and unity came at a price. Anastasius sympathized with those who opposed Chalcedon, and his policies reflected that. Crowds in Constantinople reacted with anger. Factions used religious slogans the way they used race chants, as signals of belonging and threats to enemies. In 512, unrest in the city exploded. People gathered. They shouted. They pushed through streets toward officials and clergy. Soldiers stood in lines with shields, holding the crowd back. Anastasius appeared in public to calm the situation, showing himself as ruler, showing himself as man, letting the people see his face and measure his nerve. The tension settled for a time, then rose again. A rebel named Vitalian turned this tension into a military threat. He gathered troops from Thrace and the Danube frontier, men who had grievances and men who wanted pay. He presented himself as a defender of Chalcedon. He marched toward Constantinople with an army and used the threat of violence to demand changes. He also used ships, bringing a fleet into the waters near the capital and forcing the government to respond on land and sea. The palace did not collapse. It negotiated, then fought, then negotiated again. Bribes were paid. Promises were offered. When the moment came, imperial forces struck back and broke Vitalian's power. The city gates stayed closed. The bureaucracy stayed intact. The empire stayed upright. These years look chaotic in the records, and they felt chaotic to the people living through them. A fish seller in the market cared about doctrine when doctrine determined which bishop held authority and which feast days would be celebrated. A soldier cared about doctrine when doctrine decided which general held command and whether his unit would be paid. A noble cared about doctrine when doctrine offered a banner for revolt. Underneath all of it sat the central question of survival. The Eastern Empire had lost the Western provinces and still had to feed its capital, pay its troops, and control its officials. It did that through systems that rewarded competence and punished disorder. It also did it through methods that look cold on the page. The empire deployed violence with paperwork attached. It punished rebels. It confiscated property. It exiled clergy. It blinded opponents in later centuries. The habit of harsh enforcement took root early. It grew in a world where delay could kill a dynasty. Anastasius grew old in the palace he had guarded through riots and revolts. He spent his final years surrounded by eunuchs, advisors, and guards, with petitions arriving every day. Some petitions asked for tax relief. Some asked for a judge to intervene in a property dispute. Some asked for a pardon. Each request had a name, a place, and a seal. The empire lived in those details. Outside, the city remained bright in the sun and harsh in winter. People walked over stone streets and carried water in jars. They prayed in churches filled with smoke from lamps. They watched races in the hippodrome and argued about drivers and colors. They waited for ships carrying grain. They watched foreign ambassadors file into the city in embroidered clothing and measured the gifts they brought. Constantinople still functioned as a capital because it stayed central to trade, law, and command. Even with danger on every edge, the city offered safety that drew people in. In 518, Anastasius died. The palace did not fall into immediate chaos. Guards secured the doors. Officials gathered. The question of succession rose again, urgent and practical. The man who emerged as emperor was Justin, an older soldier of humble origins who had risen through the guard. He understood the army. He understood what a pay chest meant to loyalty. He also had a nephew named Justinian who watched closely, learned quickly, and kept his own counsel. In the corridors of the palace, men spoke of continuity and stability. In the barracks, soldiers listened for news of bonuses and commands. In the churches, clergy listened for signs of doctrinal change. The Eastern Roman Empire moved into its next phase with the same tools it had used to survive the West's collapse: gold, walls, paperwork, ruthless choices made in quiet rooms. A clerk laid a stack of petitions on a table in the great palace and placed a fresh sheet of parchment on top. He dipped his pen, wrote a date, then paused as footsteps sounded in the corridor. Justinian entered with 2 guards behind him and a small group of advisors at his shoulder. He moved past the table without looking at the petitions. He walked straight to a map laid out on a second table, weighted at the corners with bronze ink pots. The map showed coastlines and ports, the Adriatic, North Africa, and the long curve of the eastern frontier. Justinian pointed to Italy with 2 fingers and asked for a report. A general answered in short phrases about ships, provisions, and the state of the troops in the Balkans. Another man spoke about the treasury. Justinian listened and asked for numbers. He kept his voice low. He used simple words. He carried himself like a man who expected obedience. In the doorway behind him, Empress Theodora arrived and stood with her hands folded, watching the men in the room. Her jewelry caught the light from the oil lamps. Her face stayed still. The room adjusted itself around her, as if the men had learned which conversations belonged in front of her and which belonged somewhere else. Justinian ruled through paperwork and fear, and he made those tools look like order. He wanted the old Roman territories back under his authority, and he wanted them to pay taxes into his treasury. He wanted the sea lanes secure for merchants who carried grain and oil and the kind of luxury goods that made courtiers smile. He also wanted the emperor's name spoken with respect in places that now belonged to kings. He sent agents with letters and gifts. He sent officers to inspect units and replace commanders. He sent tax collectors into provinces where people already complained about taxes. He also watched the church with the same careful focus he gave to the army. Priests and bishops held real power in cities. They controlled crowds. They carried the loyalty of neighborhoods. Justinian met with them in rooms that smelled of incense and wax, and he spoke to them with the calm tone of a man asking for cooperation. He expected compliance. When he did not get it, he used exile, imprisonment, and confiscation. Theodora watched those decisions too. She had grown up close to crowds and close to violence. As a young woman, she had worked in the theater and in the circus world, with performers who had to smile under shouting and thrown objects. In the palace, she brought that same awareness of mood and danger. She read faces quickly. She remembered names. She kept her own network of supporters, including clergy and court officials, who owed their position to her approval. In January of 532, the city broke open. The racing factions in the Hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, had turned their rivalries into politics, and their politics into street fighting. Men carried clubs and knives. They attacked each other in alleys and then disappeared into the crowds. Some were arrested, some were sentenced. 2 condemned men survived a botched execution and took refuge in a church. The factions demanded mercy for them. Justinian refused and then wavered, and the crowd treated that wavering as weakness. On the day of races, the stands filled with shouting. The emperor sat in his box above the track with guards close by. The chanting began as a demand, then became an insult, then became a threat. Nika, conquer. The word rolled through the hippodrome, while the emperor's officials watched the mass of bodies below. Within hours, the crowd spilled into the streets. Fires started. Smoke rose over the city. The rioters targeted symbols of authority. They burned buildings, including the Church of Hagia Sophia, and the flames spread to nearby structures. Men dragged furniture into the streets and broke it for fuel. A group stormed the prison and freed inmates who joined the chaos. Another group shouted the name of a rival claimant to the throne and moved through the city like a marching column, picking up more men as they went. Justinian retreated into the palace complex while the noise grew louder outside the gates. Inside, advisors argued in tight voices. Some urged flight to the harbor, where a ship could carry the emperor across the Bosporus. Justinian listened. He looked tired. Theodora stepped forward and spoke in a flat, direct voice that left little room for debate. She said she would stay. She said she would face whatever happened inside the city. Her words held the room because everyone understood the alternative. Flight meant civil war and a likely death later. Justinian gave orders. Belisarius and Mundus gathered troops, including guards and loyal soldiers. They prepared an attack through the entrances of the hippodrome, while the crowd below still believed it held power. The soldiers entered and moved down the aisles in tight formation. They killed men where they sat. They killed men who tried to climb over the walls. They killed men who ran toward the exits. By the end of the day, the track and stands held bodies and blood and broken benches. Justinian kept the throne. The city counted its dead. People walked through burned streets the next morning and stepped over charred beams and fallen tiles. Merchants opened shops with smoke stains still on the shutters. Men in authority walked with escorts. Everyone learned the limits of public anger. Justinian treated the destruction as a chance to rebuild the city in a way that advertised control. He ordered a new Hagia Sophia to rise where the burned church had stood. He hired Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, men who understood geometry and materials, and he gave them money and labor. Work crews arrived from across the empire. They hauled stone blocks and mixed mortar. They brought marble columns from older temples and buildings. Ships unloaded loads of brick and timber. Foremen shouted orders. Engineers measured and remeasured. The building site stayed loud from dawn to dusk. Justinian visited. He watched the dome take shape as masons laid brick in curved courses. He stood with officials as gold and glass mosaics were carried inside. He also ordered a legal project that mattered as much as any church. He put Tribonian in charge of a commission to collect and organize centuries of Roman law. Scribes copied old texts in rooms filled with the smell of ink and scraped parchment. They argued over wording. They compared versions and crossed out lines. They produced volumes that could be cited in court, used by administrators, and taught to students. Justinian expected the law to carry his authority into places he would never see. A governor in Syria could enforce a contract under Justinian's code. A judge in Egypt could decide a dispute using the same principles. The empire gained a tool that worked quietly, then worked again the next day and the next. War remained the main act. Justinian watched the Western kingdoms with interest and patience. North Africa had once been Rome's breadbasket and now belonged to the Vandals, a ruling class with its own court and its own churches, and a fleet that threatened sea trade. Italy belonged to the Ostrogoths, who kept Roman administration in place while they held military power. Justinian saw opportunity. He built a case for intervention through a mix of diplomacy and legal claims. When the moment came, he gave the order. In 533, Belisarius sailed with a fleet and an army across the sea toward Africa. The ships carried soldiers, horses, weapons, and barrels of water. They carried spare rigging and grain. They carried scribes who kept lists and officers who enforced discipline. Belisarius landed near Caput Vada and marched along the coast toward Carthage. The Vandal king Gelimer moved to meet him. The first major clash came near a place called Ad Decimum. The fighting stayed confused, with units losing contact and commanders trying to gather men while dust rose and men shouted. Belisarius kept control long enough to take advantage of Vandal mistakes. His troops pushed through and the Vandals retreated. Belisarius entered Carthage and ordered his men to stay disciplined. He posted guards. He punished looting. He understood that a city could turn against an occupier fast when soldiers acted like thieves. The next battle at Tricamarum broke the Vandal army. Gelimer fled and then surrendered. He was brought to Constantinople later and marched in a triumph, a captive king walking under guard while crowds watched from the streets. Justinian gained Africa and the tax revenue that came with it. He also gained a model for conquest. Use a skilled commander, keep discipline, move fast, present the outcome as restoration. Italy took longer and cost more. The first moves looked easy. Belisarius took Sicily, then crossed to the mainland, took Naples after a hard siege, and entered Rome. The city of Rome still carried symbolic value, and Justinian wanted it under his name. The Gothic court responded with force. They besieged Rome. Belisarius held the walls, repaired breaches, and ran supplies into the city under pressure. The fighting dragged on through months of hunger and disease and constant skirmishes outside the gates. People in Rome died of wounds and sickness. Animals died too. The streets filled with the smell of refuse. When the siege lifted, the war continued in marches and counter-marches across a devastated countryside. Justinian ordered reinforcements and demanded results. He also watched another front. In 540, the Persian king Khosrow crossed the frontier and took Antioch, one of the great cities of the east. Persian troops looted and carried captives away. Justinian faced a decision. He had poured resources into Italy, and now his eastern provinces faced direct attack. He negotiated with Khosrow, using payments to buy time, then tried to manage both wars at once. That balance depended on money, and the money came from taxes. Tax collectors pushed harder. Officials looked for arrears. Villages that had survived earlier conflicts now faced demands backed by soldiers. People paid when they could. People hid grain when they could. People bribed officials when they could. In 541 and 542, another disaster arrived by ship. The first cases appeared in the capital, then spread. People developed fever. Some developed swellings in the groin or under the arm. Many died within days. The city's normal routines fell apart. Families stayed indoors. Workers abandoned jobs. Corpses lay in houses because relatives feared touching them. The government tried to respond. Officials organized burial teams. They dug pits and filled them fast. They used carts to carry bodies. They recruited men with payments and threats. Priests performed rites over rows of dead with little time between prayers. Justinian himself fell ill. Guards restricted access to the palace rooms. Advisors waited in corridors for news. Theodora remained present and alert, speaking to officials, keeping the chain of command working. Justinian survived. Many of the city did not. When the deaths slowed, Constantinople remained scarred. Some shops never reopened. Some neighborhoods lost whole households. The state still demanded taxes, and the population had shrunk. That mismatch created pressure that never fully eased. The later years of Justinian's reign carried both victories and consequences. In Italy, the Gothic War revived under a capable leader named Totila, who retook cities and threatened Roman positions. Justinian recalled Belisarius, then sent him again, then replaced him, chasing outcomes with commanders as if changing a man could change the structure of the problem. Finally, he sent Narses with a larger force and a clear mandate. Narses moved with care, secured routes, and met the Goths in major battles. The last resistance collapsed, and Justinian could claim Italy as imperial territory. The claim looked clean on a map. The ground looked different. Many cities sat damaged, farms lay abandoned, roads had grown unsafe. The state still needed revenue and recruits. Justinian also faced problems closer to the capital. Slavs and other groups pushed into the Balkans, raiding and taking captives. Fortresses needed repairs. Garrisons needed pay. The emperor sat in his palace and issued orders. and each order required money and men to carry it out. Theodora died in 548, and Justinian continued without her, older and more solitary, surrounded by officials who watched his moods and tried to guess his next demand. He attended ceremonies in Hagia Sophia under the great dome he had ordered built. He listened to choirs. He watched candles flicker in rows. He left the church and returned to the palace and read reports about casualties, shipments, and disputes. The empire under Justinian looked immense and controlled from the capital, and it also depended on constant pressure applied from the top. When he died in 565, the treasury had been drained by war and rebuilding. The population had suffered from plague, and the borders required more soldiers than the state could comfortably supply. His successors inherited restored territories and a set of bills that never stopped arriving. The man who carried the news of Justinian's death walked through the palace corridors with a folded strip of parchment held against his chest. Guards at the doorway glanced at the seal and stepped aside. Inside, Justin II stood near a window looking out over tiled roofs and the line of the seawalls beyond. He turned when the courier entered, took the message, read it, and handed it to a court official without a word. A few minutes later, servants brought in wax tablets, ink, and clean parchment. A clerk sharpened a reed pen with a small knife and waited for the first dictated order. Justinian had left behind marble and law books and a long list of enemies who measured the empire by its weakest border. Justin II inherited all of it in one morning. The empire still had Italy on paper, Africa on paper, and parts of Spain on paper. The empire also had empty rooms where tax records used to be neat and predictable. Men at the treasury office opened chests, counted coin, and wrote totals in columns. The totals failed to match the needs of the army. The army already knew. Soldiers had families in the city. Soldiers talked in taverns. Soldiers listened to rumors the way sailors listened to weather. Within a few years, the map began to change again, this time in ways that made the conquests look like a gamble that had come due. In 568, Lombard war bands crossed into Italy. They came on foot and horseback with weapons and supplies, with families and priests and wagons. They took towns that could not pay garrisons. They took fields that could not grow crops during siege. Byzantine officials in Ravenna sent letters to Constantinople asking for money and troops. The letters arrived. They were read. Replies went out with careful language and thin promises. Ships carried some reinforcements, then carried fewer. Commanders in Italy held a few coastal cities and a corridor of territory, and they watched the interior slip away. In the Balkans, Avar riders and Slavic raiders crossed rivers, burned villages, and carried people off in ropes. Imperial officers tried to gather forces to stop them. Those forces cost money. The treasury remained tight. Justin II made choices that looked confident in ceremonies and looked panicked in private meetings. He stopped paying subsidies to Persia, then faced the Persian army across the frontier. He demanded results from generals who worked with undermanned units. He argued with advisors. He shouted. He lost sleep. The people around him adjusted their tone and watched his face for signs of anger. The empire moved forward under a ruler who needed calm and gave the opposite. When his behavior grew erratic, his wife, Sophia, and senior officials pushed him aside and elevated a general named Tiberius to carry the work. This was a palace solution, quick and practical, with legal wording to make it look clean. The borders did not care about legal wording. Maurice, who followed Tiberius, tried to run the state like a man balancing ledgers. He fought on multiple fronts. He pushed back against Persia in the east. He tried to stop raids in the Balkans. He issued orders about supply and discipline. He expected the army to endure hardship in the field to reduce costs. Soldiers slept in wet camps and ate thin rations and listened to commanders speak about savings. When a ruler starts treating soldiers like numbers, soldiers start treating the ruler like a target. In 602, Maurice ordered troops on the Danube to spend the winter beyond the river to save money on supplies. The order reached the camps. Men sat around fires and argued. Officers tried to enforce the command. The army refused. The mutiny spread fast. The troops chose a leader, a centurion named Phocas, and marched toward Constantinople. Maurice tried to respond with palace measures. He sent messages and tried to negotiate. He tried to secure the city. The attempt failed. Phocas entered the capital with soldiers at his back and took the throne. Maurice fled with his family across the water to Chalcedon. Phocas sent men after him. They caught Maurice and brought him back under guard. Maurice stood on a shore or a dock, close enough to smell salt and tar, and watched as his sons were brought out and killed in front of him one by one. Then the executioners killed him. Soldiers who had once sworn loyalty stood close and watched. Some looked away. Some stared. Phocas returned to the city and began ruling through intimidation, rewarding allies, punishing rivals, and searching for plots in every corner of the palace. Across the eastern border, the Persian king Khosrow II received reports about the coup and the executions. He had once been helped by Maurice during an earlier Persian civil conflict. He had reasons of policy and reasons of pride. He gathered his commanders and moved. Persian armies crossed into Byzantine territory under a stated goal of restoring order and avenging Maurice. The stated goal looked noble in letters. The movement looked like conquest on the ground. In 603, towns along the frontier fell. In the following years, Persian forces pushed deeper, taking cities that had resisted for centuries. Byzantine generals tried to stop them, while the palace in Constantinople turned inward. Phocas feared conspiracy more than invasion. He replaced commanders, executed suspects, and filled the court with men who said what he wanted to hear. Provinces paid the price. Reports arrived with lists of captured cities, missing units, and refugees flooding roads. The palace read them and stamped them and filed them. The Persians kept marching. In 611, they took Antioch. In 613, they won a major battle near the city and broke Byzantine resistance in the region. In 614, Persian troops entered Jerusalem. They looted churches and carried off treasures. They took the relic known as the True Cross and sent it east as a trophy. Clergy in Constantinople spoke about this in sermons. People in the city listened and crossed themselves, and then asked whether the grain ships would still arrive. The grain ships mattered because the city's population still needed daily bread, and the state still needed order inside the walls. In 619, Persian forces entered Egypt. They took Alexandria. They gained the province that had long supplied grain to the capital. Merchants in Constantinople watched prices rise. Officials at granaries recalculated rations. Soldiers at the gates watched the crowds more carefully. In 610, while the Persian armies advanced, another fleet entered the harbor of Constantinople. Heraclius arrived from Africa with ships and soldiers, backed by the local elite of Carthage, who had decided that Phocas would destroy the empire if he stayed in power. The fleet anchored. Men in armor climbed onto the docks. Crowds gathered. The city guard assessed the situation and chose sides. Inside the palace, Phocas tried to rally support. He failed. Heraclius's supporters seized Phocas, dragged him into a public place, and killed him. The new emperor began his reign with blood in the streets and a problem list that could fill a room. Heraclius held meetings that lasted into the night. He spoke with treasury officials. He spoke with generals. He spoke with clergy, including the patriarch, who held influence over the population and access to church wealth. The conversations produced decisions that sounded extreme and also sounded necessary. The state needed money to pay troops. Heraclius allowed the use of church plate and church funds for the war effort. Clergy cooperated. Officials collected what they could. Workmen melted objects in furnaces and poured metal into forms. Scribes recorded weights and totals. The war shifted from a distant frontier problem to a survival problem. Persian forces stood within reach of the capital's supply lines. The Balkans remained unstable. Avars and Slavs raided up to the long walls outside Constantinople. Heraclius faced the old imperial equation with sharper numbers: pay the army or lose the army. Lose the army and lose the capital. Heraclius made a decision that alarmed many in his court. He chose to take command in person and carry the war to the enemy. He left the city with a field army and marched into Anatolia, moving along roads where villages stood damaged and fields had gone untended. He brought priests and relics to strengthen morale. He brought engineers to repair bridges and manage siege equipment. He brought supply officers who kept track of grain, fodder, and coin. The army moved in disciplined columns when it could, and in scattered groups when terrain forced it. Heraclius learned quickly that this war would be won through marching and wintering and marching again, through negotiation with local leaders, and through controlling the routes that moved food and troops. He aimed at Persian forces when he could. He avoided fights when he needed to preserve men. He also worked through alliances. He communicated with Turkic groups north of the Caucasus and offered payments and status in exchange for pressure on Persia's flanks. His letters traveled by courier across mountains and through hostile areas. Some couriers made it. Some disappeared. The campaign continued anyway. In 626, while Heraclius fought in the east, the capital faced its own crisis. Avars marched toward Constantinople with a large force, bringing siege equipment and allied Slavic boats. Persian troops reached the Asian shore across the Bosporus and waited, unable to cross because the Byzantine navy controlled the water. The city prepared. Gates were secured. The walls were manned. Stores of arrows and stones were moved into place. Women carried water to defenders. Priests walked along sections of wall with icons held high, and soldiers watched them pass. Outside the walls, the Avars attacked. They brought ladders. They tried to breach gates. Slavic boats moved across the water and attempted to land troops. Byzantine forces repelled them with missiles and close combat. Men fought on the ramparts with spears and swords. They pushed ladders away with poles. They threw rocks. They poured burning material onto attackers. The assault continued for days. The city's defenders held. The navy destroyed boats on the water. Without coordination with the Persians across the strait, the Avars could not complete the encirclement. The Avars withdrew. Their retreat left broken equipment and dead men in the ditches. Constantinople remained standing. Inside the city, officials counted remaining supplies and prepared for the next threat. Heraclius pressed harder. In 627, he moved deep into Persian territory with a smaller army, choosing speed and surprise over size. He marched through cold weather, along rough roads, with troops who wrapped cloth around their legs and hands. Scouts rode ahead. They returned with reports of Persian movements. Heraclius's army met a Persian force near Nineveh. The fighting took place on open ground, with visibility limited at times by weather and dust. Units closed and separated and closed again. Soldiers stabbed and hacked at close range. Horses fell. Commanders shouted. Heraclius stayed near the action. He moved with his guards and tried to keep his men focused. The Persians retreated after heavy losses. Heraclius pushed forward and threatened the Persian heartland. Persian nobles turned against their king. Khosrow II was removed and killed. The new Persian leadership opened negotiations. In 628, terms were agreed. Persian forces withdrew from Byzantine territory. Captured cities returned to imperial control. The true cross was returned. Heraclius traveled with it later, bringing it back in a public ceremony. People watched from streets and church doors as clergy carried the relic and the emperor followed, dressed for ritual and display. The empire had survived a war that had reached into its core provinces. It had done so through desperate finance, relentless campaigning, and palace stability after a violent coup. The cost remained visible. Towns lay damaged. Many soldiers were dead. Whole districts in the east had changed hands multiple times. The empire's administration returned to these places and tried to restart tax collection and law courts, as if routine could erase the last 20 years. Then, a new series of reports began arriving from the south. Arab forces, newly united under Islam, moved out of Arabia and into the borderlands. The first raids looked familiar. Border troops had seen raids for centuries. These raids increased in scale and coordination. Commanders in Syria sent requests for reinforcements. Heraclius had little to spare. The army had fought Persia for a generation. Units were under strength. Horses were scarce. The treasury had been stretched by years of emergency measures. In 634 and 635, battles took place across Syria. Cities surrendered after negotiations. Others resisted and were taken. In 636, Byzantine forces gathered near the Yarmouk River to stop the advance. The army included regular troops and allied contingents. The officers argued over deployment. The battle unfolded over several days. The Byzantines faced mobile opponents who used cavalry effectively and maintained pressure. The Byzantine line broke. Soldiers fled. Many died in pursuit or fell into ravines. The defeat opened Syria to further conquest. Heraclius received the news while in the north, and the report would have carried lists of losses, names of commanders, and the short phrases that signaled catastrophe. He traveled back toward the capital and stopped in Antioch. He looked at the city he had once regained and now risked losing again. He ordered evacuations of officials and moved what treasure he could. He withdrew. Jerusalem fell after a siege and negotiation in 637. Egypt followed. Byzantine forces tried to defend the Nile routes and the fortified points, but the province fell in stages. Alexandria surrendered in 642. Grain supplies shifted to new authorities. Constantinople adjusted its supply network again, relying more on Anatolia and the Black Sea. The empire shrank fast. The people in the capital still watched races. The bureaucracy still wrote letters. The palace still held ceremonies. Beyond the walls, the map had changed. Heraclius aged during these years. His hair turned grey. His health deteriorated. He spent more time in rooms where advisors spoke softly and where the smell of medicine mixed with lamp smoke. He had sons by different wives, and factions formed around them. Courtiers watched the succession question the way vultures watch a road. The emperor's victories against Persia remained real, and they also looked distant as new defeats arrived. When he died in 641, the empire retained its capital, its Anatolian heartland, and parts of the Balkans and Italy. It had lost Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, provinces that had fed the treasury and the army. The state reacted through practical measures. It reorganized military districts in Anatolia to support local defense and reduce the cost of long campaigns. It shifted resources toward fleets and fortified positions. It relied on the walls and the navy again. The officials who managed these changes did not speak about destiny. They spoke about rations, recruitment, ships, and pay. The empire had survived the fall of the West, survived plague, survived civil war, survived Persian occupation, and survived the siege of its capital. It now faced a neighbor with momentum and discipline, and it had fewer provinces to fund resistance. The men who ran Constantinople understood the pattern. A crisis arrived. The state narrowed its focus. It spent what it had. It demanded obedience. It lived through another year. The first order went out while the city still smelled of burned pitch from the last attack at sea. A messenger carried it from the palace to the gatehouse guards, then to the harbor offices, then to the clerks who kept lists of church property. Constantinople had survived the siege of 717 and 718 through hard choices and hard weather. Leo, the new emperor, had taken the throne with soldiers at his back and an enemy army outside the walls. Arab troops camped on the landward side with tents and livestock, and their fleet filled the water with sails and oars. The defenders locked the gates and rationed food. Men carried stones to the walls and stacked arrows in bundles. At night, sentries walked the towers with lamps covered by cloth to keep the light low. The navy waited for the right moment and then pushed out with tubes and pumps that sprayed burning liquid onto enemy ships. Wood caught fast. Men jumped into the water. Some sank under armor. Some clung to debris and were picked up later as prisoners. Winter arrived and made the siege worse for the attackers. Animals died. Soldiers shivered in wet clothing. When the Bulgars struck the Arab camp from the north, the attackers faced fighting on ground that had already turned into churned mud. The city endured. When spring came, the enemy withdrew. The streets filled again. Merchants reopened stalls. Priests held Thanksgiving services. Leo listened to the prayers and watched the crowds, and he judged the mood as carefully as he judged a frontier report. He had a battered empire on his hands, and he needed obedience. He also needed an explanation that would hold the public still when the next crisis came. Leo chose the churches. The capital and the provinces were full of images. Christ painted on wood panels, the Virgin on gold backgrounds, saints in mosaics over doors, angels in frescoes above arches. People touched them. People kissed them. People carried them in processions through streets and fields. Some soldiers wore small icons in pouches under their armor. Some sailors nailed them to a mast. Some mothers held them over a child with a fever. Leo looked at these images, and he saw crowds moving under their influence. He saw monks and bishops acting as gatekeepers, deciding which images were holy and which were suspect, deciding who had access and who did not. He also saw an empire that had lost Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, and he saw Arab armies still pressing at the borders. He issued an order that changed daily life in every town with a church. Officials would remove and destroy icons in public worship. Clergy would stop encouraging their veneration. The police and the army would enforce compliance. The message traveled as ink on parchment and as shouted instructions at city gates. In Constantinople, workers climbed ladders to reach an icon above the bronze gate of the palace complex. A crowd gathered and shouted at them. Someone threw a stone. A man on the ladder lost balance and fell. Soldiers moved in with shields and clubs. People ran. Some were caught. Some were dragged away. The next day, the ladder went up again and the image came down. The policy did not move like a clean knife through the empire. It moved like a bar fight that spreads from table to table. In some places, local bishops cooperated and told their congregations to obey. In other places, monks locked church doors and stood in front of the icons with their arms out. In some towns, soldiers arrived, broke the doors, and pulled men aside by their hair. Icons were carried out and burned in courtyards. Wooden panels cracked in the fire. Gold leaf curled and blackened. Smoke rose over neighborhoods where people had prayed for years. The state seized monastic lands and property and redirected income to the treasury and the army. Clerks inventoried silver cups, candlesticks, and reliquaries. They wrote totals on tablets and sealed storerooms. Some bishops lost their seats. Some monks were arrested and sent to prison in chains. Others fled into mountains and lived in caves or small villages where sympathetic families fed them. Leo had supporters who agreed with him and opponents who feared his policies. He used the methods every emperor used. He rewarded loyalty with offices. He punished resistance with exile and property seizures. He also had to keep the army focused, because the army guarded the walls and marched to the frontiers. Any civil dispute that weakened discipline could turn into a disaster at the next battle. The violence on the border did not pause for theology. Arab forces tested the eastern defenses year after year, probing for weakness along mountain passes and open plains. In the Balkans, Slavic groups settled in abandoned areas and raided when opportunity appeared. The state responded by reorganizing its remaining resources into military districts. Farmers in Anatolia were tied to land and service obligations. Officers in these districts managed local defense and provided troops when the emperor called. Men who had once traveled far with expeditionary armies now guarded valleys near their homes. The system improved survival. It also gave local commanders more power and made internal politics sharper. An emperor needed the loyalty of these commanders and the loyalty of their soldiers. Leo worked the system with care and suspicion. He chose reliable men. He watched for ambition. He also raised his son Constantine to inherit the job with a hard education in violence and administration. When Constantine V took power, he treated the conflict over images as a problem that needed a decisive solution. He also treated it as a test of authority. In 741, a rival named Artabazdos seized Constantinople for a time and presented himself as a protector of icons. His supporters held sections of the city and used the church as a base. Constantine gathered loyal troops, marched back, and took the city after fighting in streets and at gates. When he regained the palace, he punished the losers in public. He had Artabasdos blinded. He exiled or executed leaders. He moved fast to restore control of the guard units. Then he went after the institutions that backed his enemies. He targeted monasteries and the monks who opposed his icon policy. Some monasteries were closed. Some were converted to barracks or warehouses. Some monks were forced to sign statements of compliance. Others were paraded through the city as a warning. Constantine held a council in 754 at Hieria, across the water from Constantinople, and pushed through official condemnations of icon veneration. Bishops signed the decrees. Scribes copied them. Couriers carried them to provincial centers. Churches were instructed to remove images and replace them with crosses or simple decoration. Some artisans who made icons lost their livelihood and found other work. Some continued in secret, painting small panels that could be hidden under clothing or stored in a jar. Constantine also fought. His wars mattered because they proved his legitimacy to the army. He campaigned against Arab forces in Anatolia, raiding and counter-raiding along the frontier. He campaigned against the Bulgars in the north, leading troops through passes and across rivers. He built and rebuilt fortifications. He moved populations to strengthen strategic areas, relocating families from one region to another under guard. A family could wake up in a village near the coast and be told to pack what they could carry and march inland to a new settlement. The state issued orders and enforced them with soldiers. That kind of control kept the empire from collapsing. It also created anger that simmered for decades. Constantine died in 775 after years of these efforts. The empire remained intact, the border still held. The internal conflict over images remained unfinished, and it waited for a ruler who needed a different coalition. Irene arrived at the center of power through marriage, then stayed there through force and patience. She came from Athens and learned palace politics fast. After her husband Leo IV died, she served as regent for their son Constantine VI, who was still young. Irene met with ministers and generals and bishops. She listened to reports about the army and about factions in the city. She also met with icon supporters and used their networks. In 787, she convened a council at Nicaea and restored the veneration of icons as official policy. Church interiors changed again. Painters and mosaic workers returned to work. Images of Christ and saints reappeared on walls and panels. People who had hidden icons brought them out. Priests held ceremonies to reinstall them. Irene gained support from many clergy and many urban residents. She also faced a serious problem. Her son grew older and wanted real power. The army watched him. Some generals preferred a male ruler who led campaigns in person. Court officials shifted their loyalties as they usually did. Irene treated the problem like a threat to her survival. In 797, she ordered her son seized. Guards took him into custody inside the palace complex. They blinded him. He did not recover. Irene ruled alone afterward, surrounded by advisors who praised her in public and calculated their chances in private. In the West, the consequences arrived with ceremony and steel. Rome had its own bishop, its own political needs, and its own security fears. The Pope depended on local allies and faced pressure from Lombards and other powers in Italy. He also watched Constantinople from a distance and judged legitimacy through both theology and politics. Irene ruled as sole emperor. Western leaders treated that fact as an opening. In 800, on Christmas Day, the Pope crowned Charlemagne as emperor in Rome. The act took place in a church filled with clergy and armed men. The crown was placed on Charlemagne's head in front of the altar. People shouted acclamations. The message was blunt. The West would claim an imperial title again under a Frankish king. The claim created competition. It also deepened distrust between Greek and Latin elites. Constantinople still had power and wealth, and it still held the language of Roman law and administration. It now faced a Western court that presented itself as a rival source of imperial authority. Diplomacy continued. Envoys traveled. Gifts were exchanged. Letters were written in careful phrases that concealed contempt behind honorifics. The conflict over icons returned again in the 9th century because emperors kept changing, and each new ruler needed a base of support. Leo V took the throne in 813 after military defeats and political turmoil. He faced pressure from an army that wanted order and victories. He also faced religious factions that used the icon issue as a rallying point. Leo reopened iconoclast policies. Officials returned to churches and removed images again. Bishops who supported icons were deposed. Monks were arrested. Some were beaten. Some were exiled to remote islands where guards could watch them and where escape required a boat. The state used prisons. The state used confiscations. The state used the same file, keeping it used for taxes and troop rolls. A person could lose a monastery and see the loss recorded in clean handwriting. Under Michael II and then Theophilus, the enforcement continued in varying intensity. Theophilus took a personal interest. He held hearings. He ordered punishments. He used ridicule as well as force, turning public humiliation into a weapon. He also fought against Arab forces and tried to maintain the frontier defense. He needed the army. He needed revenue. He needed unity in the capital. The icon conflict made unity difficult, and Theophilus treated opposition as a security threat. When Theophilus died in 842, his widow Theodora became regent for their young son Michael III. She held the palace in her hands the way Irene had, with a close circle of advisors and with careful control of appointments. Theodora chose to end the conflict in a way that favored icons and the clergy who supported them. In 843, she restored the veneration of icons and made the change public and permanent. A procession moved through Constantinople, with icons carried high. Clergy walked in vestments. Officials walked with them. Soldiers guarded the route. Crowds lined the streets. People reached out to touch the panels as they passed. The government issued proclamations. Churches restored images again. The city's walls stayed the same, and the sea stayed the same. And inside the city, the official picture of holiness returned to painted faces and gold backgrounds. Theodora used the decision to strengthen her coalition and stabilize the regency. She also knew that the empire had no spare energy for endless internal war. The treasury needed predictable revenue. The army needed predictable pay. The border needed attention. The icon struggle had consumed decades, and many people were tired of it in a practical way. A shopkeeper wanted customers. A farmer wanted a harvest. A soldier wanted boots and rations. The wit in this period sits in the paperwork. An emperor could change doctrine and still demand that tax collectors deliver the same totals. A bishop could denounce images in the morning and request an exemption for church lands in the afternoon. A general could shout slogans about faith and then negotiate a marriage alliance with the same families he accused of heresy last year. The empire stayed alive through these contradictions because its institutions kept functioning. Clerks wrote. Judges held court. Shipmasters loaded cargo. Soldiers stood on walls and marched when ordered. The emperors used religion as a lever because it moved people, and it also exposed how dangerous people could be when moved. The War of Images ended in official terms in 843, and the memory stayed. It stayed in scars on monastery doors, in missing mosaics that were never replaced, in family stories about a grandfather who went into exile, in the long habit of viewing the palace as a place where doctrine could change with a new ruler. The empire walked forward into the next century with its icons restored, its rivals multiplying, and its borders still contested by men who cared very little about what hung on a church wall. A bronze seal hit a wooden table in a provincial office at Adrianople, and the clerk flinched as if the metal had struck his knuckles. The messenger who delivered it stood with dust on his boots and a torn strap on his satchel. He had come from Constantinople. The wax tablet he carried bore orders about land, soldiers, and taxes, written in a neat hand that meant someone in the capital expected obedience without discussion. The clerk read the lines, then called for an assistant to pull the registers from a shelf. The registers smelled of old ink and smoke from lamps. Names filled the pages in tight columns. Fields, vineyards, oxen, household counts. A soldier's service obligation sat beside a farmer's acreage, as if the state could measure both with the same ruler. Outside the office, men in wool tunics hauled sacks of grain toward a storehouse under guard. The empire was rebuilding its strength in ways that looked dull from a distance and felt sharp up close. Every sack of grain meant food for a garrison. Every garrison meant a gate kept shut at the right moment. Every line in a register meant a claim backed by armed men. In Constantinople, the palace corridors filled each morning with officials carrying tablets and bundles of parchment. Eunuchs moved between doors with keys on their belts. Generals waited in antechambers with helmets under their arms. Bishops arrived with attendants and incense on their clothing. The Macedonian dynasty held the throne, and the city ran with a confidence that showed in small details, in fresh plaster on walls, in patrols that kept markets orderly, in the steady arrival of ships that brought grain and oil. The empire had survived the long century of losses, and it had adapted. Military districts in Anatolia provided troops who lived near their assigned land, men who could be summoned without dragging an army across half the world. Fortresses guarded passes. Fleets guarded the straits and the sea lanes that fed the capital. The court also used diplomacy as a weapon. Envoys traveled with gifts and letters written in careful Greek, promising friendship while aiming to separate enemies from allies. In these years, foreigners arrived in Constantinople and stared openly. They saw the walls, the harbors, the domes, and the gold. They saw disciplined guards at gates. They saw officials who understood paperwork, and they saw a city that looked expensive to attack. The wars in the east continued, and the victories began to accumulate. Arab emirates held strong points across the frontier and sent raiders into Anatolia for plunder and captives. Byzantine commanders responded with counter-raids that burned farms and seized livestock. Prisoners were marched back under guard and sold or exchanged. In the capital, captives sometimes appeared in triumphal processions, walking behind a general while the crowd watched and shouted. Some crowds threw fruit, some threw stones. The empire also rebuilt its position at sea. Crete, held by Muslim forces who used it as a base for piracy, became a bleeding wound for Byzantine trade. Merchant ships vanished. Coastal villages woke to screams and smoke. The court listened to reports and finally committed to a full operation. In 960, the general Nikephoros Phocas led a large expedition against Crete. The fleet carried siege engines, timber, and bags of nails, along with soldiers who knew they might die on an island far from home. They landed, marched toward the main fortress at Chandax, and began a siege that dragged on through months. Men dug trenches, men built ramps. Engineers measured distances. Archers fired from behind screens. Night attacks happened when the defenders tried to burn siege works. The attackers answered with buckets of water and sand. When the walls finally broke, soldiers poured into the city. Blood ran through streets that had been defended with desperation. The capture of Crete removed a threat and reopened the sea. It also proved something to the empire's enemies. Constantinople could still plan, fund, and execute a major campaign. Nikephoros' focus rose higher. He became emperor in 963 after the death of Romanos II, and he entered the palace with the manner of a man used to giving orders in a camp. He wore military clothing more often than court robes. He slept little. He listened to reports while eating, his eyes scanning a page as his hand tore bread. He kept pushing armies east. His troops took Cilicia. They pressed into northern Syria. They seized cities through assault and negotiation. The empire regained ground that had been lost for centuries. This resurgence had a cost that showed in the faces of soldiers who returned missing fingers or with scars across the cheek. It also showed in the villages that paid for the war in grain and sons. Nikephoros depended on the army and on a small circle of advisors. He also depended on a woman who sat at the center of court intrigue. Empress Theophano, the widow of Romanos II, stayed close to power. She had married Nikephoros to secure her position. She watched his austerity and his suspicion. She also watched another man, John Tzimiskes, a talented general with charm and ambition. Courtiers whispered. Servants listened at doors. One night in December 969, conspirators entered the palace through a passage known to insiders. They moved through dark corridors, past sleeping guards, and reached the emperor's room. Nikephoros woke to footsteps and raised his hands. The attackers killed him on the floor. In the morning, John Tzimiskes stood in court robes and claimed the throne, while Theophano was sent away into exile. The palace cleaned the blood and returned to routine within days. This was Byzantine politics at its most efficient. A ruler died. The state continued. John Tzimiskes fought like a man who knew his legitimacy rested on results. He campaigned in the east and won victories that allowed him to enter conquered cities with processions and public prayers. He also faced trouble from the north. The Rus, a people who traveled by river and sea with long boats, had entered the Black Sea and pressed into the Balkans. Their leaders saw opportunity in Bulgarian territory and in imperial weakness. They came with axes, spears, and a brutal willingness to take what they wanted. Byzantine officials gathered intelligence through merchants and scouts. Messages arrived in the palace with names of towns attacked and numbers of captives taken. John responded with a campaign that involved marches through muddy roads and battles near fortified points. His troops pushed the Rus back, fought them at close range, and forced their leaders into negotiations. The empire used a familiar method afterward. It offered gifts and agreements that redirected the danger away from Constantinople. The court understood that a battle could end a raid and a treaty could redirect a decade. By the time Basil II emerged as the central ruler, the empire looked strong and also dangerously dependent on capable leadership. Basil became emperor as a young man, and older officials attempted to control him. Basil watched. He learned the faces of those who spoke in court. He learned which men controlled troops, which men controlled money, which men controlled access to him. Two powerful generals, Bardas Skleros and Bardas Phokas, rose in rebellion at different times, backed by armies and by networks of aristocratic families who had grown rich on provincial land. Basil responded with patience and brutality. He built coalitions, used rivalries, and hired allies when needed. At one point, he reached out to the ruler of the Rus and offered a deal that brought foreign soldiers into imperial service. The men arrived as tall guards with heavy weapons and a direct manner, the kind of men who could hold a corridor while courtiers panicked. Basil used them. He also used the war to reshape the balance of power inside the empire. Each rebellion gave him a reason to break estates, confiscate property, and reduce the independence of powerful families. He issued laws aimed at keeping smallholders from losing land to magnates, because smallholders provided taxes and soldiers. A landowner who swallowed villages also swallowed recruits. Basil understood that. His policies had sharp edges. A family could lose land with a stroke of a pen and a squad of soldiers at the door. Basil chose Bulgaria as the central battlefield of his reign. The Bulgarian state under Tsar Samuel controlled mountains, passes, and fortresses that blocked Byzantine movement in the Balkans. Bulgarian raiders struck into imperial territory, burned villages, and took captives. The Danube frontier remained active with other threats as well, but Bulgaria stood closest and hurt most consistently. Basil took this personally and pursued the war year after year. He did not treat it as a seasonal campaign for loot. He treated it as an elimination project. He marched in spring and summer. He marched in autumn. He built roads and repaired bridges. He hauled siege equipment through passes that forced men to move single file. He camped in rain. He slept in a tent with guards outside. He ate what the army ate. When his troops suffered setbacks, he punished commanders and replaced them. When towns resisted, he besieged them. He cut supply lines. He waited while hunger did the work. The war filled the ledgers with expenses and filled graveyards with dead men. The decisive moment came in 1014 at the Pass of Clydian. Samuel had fortified the route with earthworks and wooden barriers, positioned to block Basil's advance. The Byzantine army arrived and assessed the defenses. Engineers examined the ground. Officers argued about routes. Basil ordered attacks that failed at first and cost lives. Then a detachment found a path around the Bulgarian position, a route through rough terrain that required effort and silence. The flanking force emerged behind Samuel's line and attacked. The Bulgarian defenders collapsed under pressure from front and rear. Men dropped shields and ran. Others fought and died where they stood. Basil's troops captured thousands. The aftermath revealed Basil's approach to war as governance. He ordered the prisoners divided into groups and blinded, leaving one man in each group with one eye to guide the rest. Soldiers carried out the work with knives and hot irons. The blinded men stumbled, bled, and cried out. They were marched back toward Bulgaria. When Samuel saw his troops return in that condition, he suffered a collapse and died soon after. Basil continued. He took fortress after fortress. He accepted surrenders. He relocated populations. He appointed administrators. By 1018, Bulgaria fell under imperial control. Basil entered the region as ruler. He issued orders about taxes and church organization. The empire gained territory, recruits, and a secure northern frontier. Basil also gained a reputation that traveled. People spoke of him with fear in regions that had resisted. People in Constantinople spoke of him with relief because the long war had ended in victory. Life in the capital during Basil's reign held a strange mix of celebration and menace. The city hosted ceremonies with banners and choirs while the army killed and marched beyond the horizon. In the palace, diplomats from distant lands waited for audiences. They brought gifts. They presented letters. They watched court ritual with a mixture of awe and calculation. Basil used these audiences to shape foreign perceptions. He kept them waiting when he wanted to assert dominance. He gave lavish gifts when he wanted to buy peace. He also kept his own nobles on a short leash. Powerful families learned caution. They spoke carefully. They married into the right circles. They avoided open displays of ambition. Eunuchs and officials in Basil's service gained influence because they depended on the emperor and had fewer independent power bases. Basil preferred that. He trusted men who needed him. He also preferred results over charm. Courtiers who expected warmth found a ruler who gave orders and left the room. Basil's military success rested on a state that could feed armies and move money. Tax collection continued with intensity. Officials inspected villages and assessed obligations. Farmers paid in coin or in kind. When they could not pay, they faced penalties that might include seizure of property. The state kept storage facilities for grain and equipment. It maintained arsenals. It maintained shipyards. Constantinople's harbor remained crowded. Ships arrived with timber, grain, and luxury goods. Foreign merchants paid fees and negotiated with officials. The city stayed rich enough to support large construction and elaborate ritual. Churches were maintained. Monasteries held property. Artisans produced icons, jewelry, and fine textiles. Scholars copied manuscripts. This cultural activity did not require grand speeches. It required stability, patronage, and a market. Basil's victories contributed to that stability. His harsh, internal control also contributed. People could predict the rules even when they disliked them. When Basil II died in 1025, the empire stood larger and stronger than it had in centuries. The treasury held reserves. The army held experienced troops. The borders in the Balkans looked secure. The eastern frontier remained active, but the empire had leverage and depth. Basil left no son. His brother Constantine VIII succeeded him, a man who enjoyed court life and relied on advisors. Court politics shifted. Officials sought access. Aristocratic families sensed opportunity. The discipline Basil enforced began to soften in places where enforcement depended on his personal attention. Constantine VIII had daughters and arranged marriages that would shape the next period. The palace filled with talk of alliances, dowries, and appointments. Generals watched these changes and calculated their prospects. The army still existed, still trained, still capable. The enemy states beyond the frontier also existed, still patient, still watching. The empire had reached a peak, built on constant work and constant force. That peak stood on human decisions, and the next set of decisions would determine whether the structure held. A messenger rode through the Anatolian rain with a leather satchel bouncing against his hip and a crumpled report pressed flat under his belt. He had crossed villages where roofs sagged and fields lay thin from years of raids. He reached the first major garrison and found men cleaning mud from their boots and drying bowstrings near smoky fires. The officer on duty read the report by lamplight, then sent it onward with a fresh seal. The message climbed the chain of command the way a fever moves through a household. By the time it reached Constantinople, the ink on the page described a disaster that even seasoned officials struggled to fit into routine. The Eastern army had been crushed near Manzikert. The emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, had been captured. Soldiers had scattered. Commanders had fled. Towns on the frontier began closing their gates and sending their own messengers to beg for help. In the palace, clerks copied the report into registers and attached it to earlier warnings that had been ignored or postponed. A court official carried the file into a chamber where ministers waited with tight faces and dry mouths. They asked the same questions every regime asks after a battlefield collapse. How many survivors? Which units remain? Which fortresses can still hold? How fast does the enemy move? No one in that room could answer with confidence. The Seljuk Turks did not need to conquer every city by assault. They moved into Anatolia through routes opened by panic and political paralysis. Some towns negotiated. Some surrendered. Some were abandoned by imperial troops who had lost pay and leadership. Nomad groups followed with herds and tents, taking pasture land and settling where the land suited them. Byzantine landholders fled west, carrying keys and icons, and what coin they could hide in cloth. Monasteries received refugees and wrote lists of donations promised in exchange for shelter. Tax records became fiction in districts where the state no longer collected. The army that Basil II had kept tight and disciplined had changed in the decades after his death. Court factions replaced competent commanders. Aristocratic families bought influence. Soldiers served shorter terms or avoided service through payments. The treasury bled through court spending and through the habit of solving problems with gifts. In Constantinople, officials still wore silk and still held ceremonies, and outside the walls, men with bows and light cavalry moved across the plateau that had once supplied the empire with recruits and grain. The palace responded with the weapons it knew best: intrigue, marriage, titles, and lawsuits dressed as policy. Romanos IV returned from captivity and found his throne taken by rivals. He was captured again, this time by his own people, and they blinded him. The empire moved forward under the Ducas family, then staggered under a series of rulers who spent more energy on court survival than on frontier defense. In the streets, people still bought bread and fish and wine. In the corridors, ministers still filed papers. The state still existed. The state had lost its grip on the ground that mattered. Anatolia was the heartland, filled with towns and farmland and soldiers. Losing it did not look dramatic in a single day in the capital. It looked dramatic in 100 small reports that arrived too late and were answered with too little. In 1081, a new man entered the palace with a soldier's posture and a hungry stare. Alexios Komnenos took the throne after moving through the capital with support from troops and from powerful relatives. He did not pretend the situation was stable. He treated the empire as a body on a table that required immediate surgery with rough instruments. The Normans pressed from the west, led by Robert Guiscard, men in mail and helmets who fought with discipline and came with claims to imperial legitimacy through marriage ties. The Pechenegs and other groups threatened the Balkans. The Turks held much of Anatolia. Alexios needed money, troops, and allies. He started by stripping the palace of illusions. He gathered his family into key positions. He used his mother and wife as political operators, assigning them tasks that involved bribes, appointments, and negotiations with the church. He also looked at the treasury and made decisions that would have offended earlier emperors who still believed in limitless grandeur. He debased coinage and then attempted reforms. He seized church valuables for war funding through agreements that were written and signed under pressure. He issued tax demands and enforced them with officers who had swords at their belts. People complied because the alternative involved prison, confiscation, and hunger. Alexios also did something that would reshape the Mediterranean. He asked the West for help. He sent envoys to the Pope and to Western courts, asking for mercenaries and assistance against the Turks. The request traveled through a world that had its own ambitions. When Western leaders heard about Jerusalem and the Holy Land, they heard opportunity. A pope could call for an armed pilgrimage and gain authority. A knight could gain land and status. A younger son could gain a future. The response arrived in waves. The first groups that reached Byzantine territory included poorly organized bands who looted as they marched. Alexios responded with a mix of hospitality and control. He fed them when possible. He pushed them across the Bosporus quickly. He stationed troops to limit damage. When the main crusader leaders arrived, men with titles and armed retinues, Alexios received them in formal audiences and asked them to swear oaths. He wanted captured territory returned to imperial control. He wanted cooperation. The crusader leaders swore because they needed supplies and passage, and because the gold and ceremony of Constantinople impressed them. The oaths did not create trust. They created a temporary contract. The First Crusade fought through Anatolia and into Syria, and the Byzantines gained some cities back along the coast and in western Anatolia as the Crusaders weakened Turkish forces. Alexios sent Byzantine detachments to claim surrendered towns. The empire regained Nicaea and other important positions. The Crusaders then established their own states in the Levant, and relations grew tense. Western lords treated captured land as their prize. Byzantine officials treated it as imperial territory temporarily managed by foreign soldiers. Both sides wrote letters and exchanged envoys. Both sides watched each other during negotiations with hands close to sword hilts. In Constantinople, court officials noted every insult and every breach of agreement. In the Crusader states, leaders told stories about Byzantine deception and Byzantine arrogance. The distrust hardened. The empire had gained time and some territory, and it had introduced a large, armed Western presence into the Eastern Mediterranean. Men who followed their own goals and who distrusted the capital's bureaucracy. Alexios and his successors in the Komnenos family held the empire together through competence and constant attention. John II Komnenos campaigned steadily, pushing into Anatolia, securing roads, and reclaiming towns through siege and negotiation. Manuel I Komnenos followed with ambition and a taste for Western style. He held tournaments and cultivated Western knights while maintaining Byzantine administration. He fought in Hungary, in Italy, and against Turks, spending money to project strength. He married into Western dynasties and hosted Western envoys with expensive gifts. The empire in these years looked vigorous, and it also depended on an expensive machine. Armies required pay. Fortresses required upkeep. Diplomacy required bribes and dowries. The court required spectacle. When Manuel died in 1180, his heir was young, and the court's factions moved fast. Regents fought. Ministers were dragged from office. People in the city sensed weakness and became dangerous. Andronikos Komnenos arrived like a man stepping onto a stage he believed belonged to him. He had traveled, plotted, and survived exile. He understood the crowd. He walked into Constantinople in 1182 with supporters and used public anger against the regency. The city erupted in violence against Latin residents, merchants, and families who had lived in the city for years under imperial permission. Mobs moved through neighborhoods, breaking doors, looting shops, and killing people in the streets. Bodies lay in alleys. Survivors fled to ships. Andronikos took power and ruled with paranoia. He ordered arrests. He held trials that ended in mutilation and execution. He hunted rivals and used public punishment to keep people afraid. For a time, Fear produced compliance. It also produced conspiracies. In 1185, after military failures and rising hatred, the city turned on him. He tried to flee. He was caught. The crowd tore at him, beat him, and killed him. Another emperor took the throne, Isaac II Angelos, and the pattern repeated. Court factions, military weakness, financial strain, foreign threats. The empire's internal stability frayed, while external enemies watched and adjusted. The Fourth Crusade began as a plan to attack Egypt, a strategic target that could weaken Muslim control of the Holy Land. Western leaders gathered knights, ships, and money. Venice played a central role because Venice could build and supply a fleet large enough to transport an army. The Venetians negotiated a contract. The Crusaders promised payment. When the Crusaders arrived in Venice, their numbers were smaller than expected, and their funds fell short. Venetian officials met in halls with stone floors and banners on the walls. Doge Enrico Dandolo was old and blind, and he still ran the negotiation like a man who could smell weakness. He offered a solution. The Crusaders would help Venice capture Zara, a rival city on the Adriatic that had rebelled against Venetian control. The Crusaders agreed. They attacked a Christian city. They took it. The decision revealed the expedition's core problem. It depended on money and logistics controlled by Venice, and it depended on leaders willing to justify almost any action as temporary necessity. In the winter of 1202 and 1203, another offer arrived, carried by envoys and shaped by desperation. Alexios Angelos, a Byzantine prince, had fled Constantinople after his father Isaac II had been deposed and blinded by Isaac's brother Alexios III. The young prince promised the Crusaders vast sums of money, supplies, and military support if they helped him regain the throne. He promised submission of the Byzantine Church to Rome. He promised soldiers for the Crusader cause. Venetian leadership listened. Crusader barons listened. The offer solved immediate cash problems and offered political leverage. It also aimed the expedition straight at Constantinople. The fleet sailed east and appeared before the great city's walls in 1203. The site itself mattered. Tall masts in rows, painted shields, banners snapping, oars beating the water. The citizens crowded the sea walls and watched. Some shouted, some stared in silence. In the palace, Alexios III weighed his options and chose cowardice. He fled the city with treasure, leaving the government to collapse behind him. The Crusaders forced entry through a combination of naval assault and land pressure. They breached a section of the wall and set fires that spread into residential districts. Smoke rose. People carried children and bundles through streets choked with ash. Clergy held icons and tried to calm crowds. The Crusaders installed Isaac II back on the throne, despite his blindness, and placed the young Alexios IV beside him as co-emperor. The new regime owed money it could not produce. The palace demanded taxes and confiscations. Officials seized church plate. They seized property from wealthy households. They demanded forced loans. The population resented the new rulers and resented the foreign army camped outside and then inside parts of the city. Crusader soldiers grew impatient. Venetian merchants demanded payment. The promised money did not appear. The relationship turned poisonous. Clashes broke out. Fires started again. Neighborhoods burned. The foreign army viewed the city as a hostage. The city viewed the foreign army as an occupying force. In January 1204, a coup took place inside Constantinople. A man named Alexios Doukas, called Mortsouflos, seized power. He had a thick brow and a rough manner that appealed to people who wanted a strong defender. He removed Alexios IV. The young co-emperor was imprisoned and later killed. Isaac II died soon after. The new ruler, Alexios V, prepared for a siege. He reinforced walls. He ordered patrols. He attempted to rally the city. The Crusaders and Venetians responded by deciding that the city itself would pay. They held councils in tents and on ships and spoke openly about partition. They wrote agreements that divided future spoils and future territory. They planned like men arranging an estate sale. The assault began in April 1204. Venetian ships approached the sea walls with wooden towers built on decks. Sailors and soldiers climbed ropes and ladders under missile fire. Defenders threw stones and fired arrows. The first attacks failed. Men fell into the water. Some drowned. Some were dragged out and killed on the spot. The Crusaders regrouped. They attacked again. A breach opened. Once a few men gained a foothold, more followed. They spread along the walls and opened gates for forces on land. The defense collapsed in sections. Alexios V fled during the night, leaving the city to face the attackers without a central command. What followed looked like a controlled disaster. Crusader and Venetian forces poured into streets and began looting. Soldiers broke into houses and grabbed objects that could be carried. They ripped fabric from walls and took silver from tables. They seized jewelry from women and rings from dead men. They broke open church doors and searched for relics and gold. In Hagia Sophia, men climbed onto altars, pulled down ornaments, and carried away chalices and icons. Horses were led into sacred spaces because the soldiers needed somewhere to keep animals and did not care about local reverence. Fires spread again as looters used torches and as defenders attempted last stands in dense neighborhoods. The smoke rose over the city in thick columns. People fled to monasteries, to hidden courtyards, to any place with a door that could be barred. Some were dragged out anyway. Some were killed in front of their families. Some were raped. The violence lasted days. When it slowed, the city looked stripped. Many houses stood empty with broken doors. Streets held smashed pottery and torn fabric. Dogs fought over scraps. The empire's capital, the city that had survived sieges and civil unrest for 8 centuries, had been taken by an army that claimed to fight for Christ. The conquerors established a Latin empire in Constantinople. They installed a new emperor, Baldwin of Flanders, and divided offices among Western nobles. Venice took key ports and parts of the city, securing trade advantages with written charters and armed guards. Greek officials and aristocrats fled and formed successor states. One group gathered in Nicaea in Anatolia. Another held Epirus in the west. Another held Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. These were fragments of a broken government, run by men who carried imperial titles like luggage salvaged from a burning house. In Constantinople, the new Latin regime struggled. It lacked resources. It lacked local loyalty. It faced hostile neighbors. The city itself had lost population and wealth. Many artisans had fled. Many merchants avoided the port. The Latin rulers depended on support from the West that arrived in limited amounts. The situation became a long occupation marked by scarcity, political fragility, and constant threats. The betrayal in 1204 did not come from a single villain and a single moment. It came from a chain of incentives and decisions. A crusade assembled without adequate money. A contract negotiated by Venice that required payment. A diversion to Zara that proved the leaders would attack Christians when useful. A Byzantine prince offering cash and church submission in exchange for a throne. A Venetian leadership eager to punish Constantinople for past conflicts and to secure commercial dominance. Crusader lords eager for land and loot. Byzantine rulers who fled or fought each other while the walls faced siege. The sum of these choices produced a scene that looked simple only after it happened. Ships at the seawall, ladders, fire, looters in churches, a capital emptied of treasure. The ruins did not end the Byzantine story. They set the conditions for its final act. The successor states in exile continued to claim legitimacy. They collected taxes where they could. They recruited soldiers. They negotiated with Turks and with Western powers. In the years ahead, one of those states would return and retake the city, and the city would never return to its former strength. Constantinople would remain valuable, and it would remain vulnerable. The empire had been struck in its center by men who spoke the same prayers in a different language, and the damage lasted longer than any siege by an external enemy. A small group of men slipped through a postern gate near the Blachine walls just before dawn and walked along a narrow path to the water. They carried no banners. They carried a letter sealed with wax and a pouch of coin for the boatman. Behind them, Constantinople stood half empty, in places where whole streets had once been packed with workshops and homes. The Latin Empire still held the city in name, yet the Latin court struggled to pay soldiers and struggled to fill granaries. A Venetian warehouse stood guarded, while nearby houses sat abandoned with boarded windows. On the Asian shore, the Greek successor state at Nicaea gathered strength under rulers who wore imperial titles and used imperial offices as if the capital still belonged to them. In 1261, that long preparation turned into action. Michael Palaiologos, who ruled Nicaea, had troops near the city and had scouts watching the harbor. One night, a detachment moved quietly toward the land walls, while the main Latin force and many Venetian sailors were away on an expedition. The Greeks entered through a weak point, took control of key gates, and drove Latin defenders back in short, violent clashes that ended with running and shouting in the streets. Latin residents fled toward the harbor. Some reached ships. Some were caught. When Michael entered Constantinople, he did it with ceremony because ceremony mattered, yet the scene around him showed the real condition of his prize. Churches stood damaged. Neighborhoods had fewer people than they once had. The treasury had little. The empire had returned to its capital and found a city that required repair like a wounded fortress, stone by stone, roof by roof, ledger by ledger. The Palaeologan regime kept the title and kept the rituals, and it faced enemies on every side with limited resources. The restored empire held parts of Thrace and parts of Greece and a few islands, and it also relied on agreements with Italian maritime powers that extracted privileges like toll exemptions and trading quarters. Genoese ships anchored in the Golden Horn and operated from Galata with their own walls and their own guards. Venetian merchants stayed active too. These foreign enclaves looked like neighbors and rivals at the same time. Inside the palace, officials argued about tariffs and military contracts while the countryside outside the city walls grew dangerous. Turkish groups in Anatolia expanded their territory through raids, treaties, and sieges. They took towns that had been Byzantine for centuries. They placed garrisons. They collected taxes. Byzantine commanders wrote reports that described new losses in plain terms and requested money and men that rarely arrived. In the Balkans, Serbian and Bulgarian rulers pushed their own claims. Civil wars inside Byzantium made the situation worse. Rival emperors raised troops, hired mercenaries, and paid them with promises of land and rights. When the money ran out, mercenaries looted, farmers fled, villages emptied. A civil war in the mid-14th century drew in Ottoman forces as allies, and those allies used the opportunity to gain a foothold in Europe. Ottoman troops crossed the Dardanelles, took positions, and built a base that became permanent. Byzantium still had walls around Constantinople and still had a navy in small numbers. The state had fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers, fewer farms, and fewer options. The court continued to hold ceremonies under painted ceilings while the surrounding world narrowed. By the 15th century, Constantinople existed as a city under siege conditions, even during peacetime. The land outside the walls belonged to the Ottomans. The sea remained a route for supplies, trade, and occasional help from Western Europe, yet Western help came with conditions and arrived in limited force. Emperors negotiated church union with Rome in hopes of military support, and many in the city resisted those agreements with arguments and protests. The disputes filled churches and streets while Ottoman forces continued to tighten their control over the region. In 1451, Mehmed took the Ottoman throne and prepared for the final assault. He ordered the construction of a fortress on the European side of the Bosporus, positioned to control shipping. Work crews cut stone and hauled blocks into place. Soldiers guarded the site. The fortress rose fast, and its guns threatened any ship that tried to pass without permission. In Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos met with advisors and generals and stared at maps with fewer friendly territories than his predecessors had ever seen. He inspected the walls and counted towers that needed repairs. He counted men as well. The defenders included Byzantine troops, local volunteers, and a small but skilled contingent of Genoese, led by Giovanni Giustiniani. The total was thin for a city with walls this long. Constantine ordered repairs anyway. Men filled cracks with rubble and mortar. They reinforced weak sections with timber. They positioned cannons where they had them. They stretched the great chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn to block ships. The city prepared with the tools it still possessed: stone, sweat, and discipline. On the 6th of April 1453, Mehmed's army arrived and spread across the landward approaches. Tents went up in rows. Supply carts moved through camps. Soldiers dug trenches and positioned artillery. The largest cannon, built by a gun founder named Orban, required teams of oxen to move it. When it fired, the sound carried across the city and shook windows. The stone balls hit the walls and broke masonry. Dust rose. Fragments fell. Defenders ran with baskets and boards to patch breaches during lulls. The siege became a routine of explosions, repairs, sorties, and prayers. Ottoman sappers dug tunnels to weaken foundations. Byzantine defenders dug counter-tunnels and fought underground with knives and torches in cramped spaces. At sea, Mehmed attempted to force entry into the Golden Horn. He ordered ships hauled over land on greased logs to bypass the chain, and the operation worked. One morning, defenders on the walls saw Ottoman ships in the sheltered water behind them. The sight changed the geometry of defense. The city had fewer safe zones. The defenders shifted men and weapons to new positions. Food supplies tightened. Water remained available through cisterns, yet stress showed on faces and voices. Constantine moved along the walls often. He spoke to soldiers. He thanked them. He gave orders. He watched the damage accumulate and understood what it meant. On the night of May 28, Constantine attended a service in Hagia Sophia. Clergy held candles. The building smelled of wax and incense. People stood close together. Some cried. Some stared straight ahead. After the service, Constantine returned to the walls. Before dawn on May 29, Mehmed launched a full assault. Drums beat. Horns sounded. Waves of attackers moved forward under cover of darkness and smoke. The first waves included irregular troops sent to tire the defenders. They climbed ladders and rushed breaches. They died in large numbers. The defenders fought with spears, swords, and handguns where they had them. They threw stones. They pushed ladders away. Then the more disciplined Ottoman troops advanced, including janissaries. The fighting tightened at a key breach near the gate of St. Romanos. Giustiniani was wounded and carried away. The loss of that leader broke coordination in that sector. Defenders began to pull back. An Ottoman unit entered through a weak point and gained a foothold inside the walls. More followed. Constantine moved toward the fighting with his remaining guard. He wore armor. He carried a sword. He fought in close quarters amid shouting and bodies. He disappeared in the chaos. Later, survivors searched for him and spoke about his last moments in fragments, like men recalling a street fight they barely escaped. By midday, Ottoman forces controlled the city. Soldiers moved through streets and entered houses. Some people fled toward churches. Some hid in cellars. Some tried to reach the harbor. Mehmed entered later with officers and guards and rode toward Hagia Sophia. He dismounted and stepped inside. The building still held people who had gathered there in fear. Ottoman soldiers began taking prisoners. Mehmed gave orders to secure key areas and to stop uncontrolled destruction in places he wanted intact. Over the following days, the city's population changed through death, enslavement, flight, and resettlement. Constantinople became an Ottoman capital. Churches were converted or repurposed. Administrative offices reopened under new authority. The old imperial court ended. The title and the bureaucracy that had carried Roman identity for more than 1,000 years ceased to exist in practice. The aftermath spread beyond the city. Greek scholars, scribes, and clergy carried books and knowledge westward, traveling to Italian cities where patrons paid for Greek texts and instruction. Merchants adjusted routes and agreements to the new power. Orthodox Christian communities continued under Ottoman rule with new restrictions and new protections defined by Ottoman law and local practice. In Europe, rulers used the fall as a warning and as a political tool. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Ottomans expanded further, using Constantinople as a base for administration and military power. The Byzantine Empire ended in the breach of a wall, in the collapse of a defense line, in a final charge with a sword in hand, and in a city absorbed into a different imperial system that kept the buildings and changed the rules.